The moment the rehabilitation room door clicked shut behind her, all three dogs stopped moving. Titan, 94 pounds of scarred German shepherd with a torn left ear and eyes that had seen things most humans never would, lifted his massive head and went completely still. The two handlers outside the glass froze. Dr. Marcus Holt stood at the observation window with his arms crossed, already composing the story he'd tell at the department meeting. The new nurse had lasted 40 seconds. Then Titan took one step forward, then another. Then he pressed his forehead against the woman's knee and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that made the senior handler's coffee cup slip from his fingers and shatter on the floor. In 15 years of working with military dogs, he had never seen Titan do that. Not once. Not with anyone. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all started. Briarwood Veterans Medical Center sat on the western edge of Harlan, Nevada, a mid-sized city that had never quite decided whether it wanted to be desert or suburb, and had settled somewhere uncomfortable in between. The hospital itself was a blocky, sand-colored complex that smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzzed just slightly too loud, and the vending machines on the third floor had been broken since the previous administration. It served veterans, active military dependents, and the general population with equal bureaucratic efficiency, which meant everyone waited too long and left feeling moderately let down. Nora Voss had worked there for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the exact count because she kept a small notebook in her locker. Not a diary, nothing sentimental, just a record of things she noticed. Patient reaction times, supply shipment delays, which doctors communicated with staff and which ones communicated at staff. She'd been keeping notebooks like that since she was 22 years old, and the habit had never fully left her. On paper, Nora was a level 2 trauma nurse assigned to the emergency and surgical recovery units. She was 36, medium height, kept her brown hair pulled back so tight it looked painted on, and wore the same pair of worn tactical boots with her scrubs every single day because she hated the way standard nursing shoes made her feel like she was walking on pillows. She didn't socialize much during shift changes. She didn't attend the monthly potluck lunches. She brought her own food, kept her own schedule, and went home at the end of every shift without making a scene about anything. The other nurses mostly liked her, in the distracted way you like someone who is consistently competent and never creates drama. The doctors mostly ignored her, which was how most doctors at Briarwood treated nursing staff, as functional furniture. Present when needed, invisible otherwise. Dr. Marcus Holt was not most doctors. He was the director of emergency and rehabilitation services, a position he had held for 6 years and intended to hold until retirement. I was 53 years old, 6 feet tall, and had the kind of jaw that photographed well in hospital brochures. He had a medical degree from a university with a good football team, a second ex-wife who'd become a department head at a competing facility, and a theory, settled, comfortable, and completely non-negotiable, that the quality of a person could be read in the first 30 seconds of interaction. He believed in hierarchy the way some people believed in weather. It was simply a condition of existence. Those above managed, those below complied. Anyone who didn't understand that arrangement was either naive or a problem. He had decided Nora Voss was naive within the first week of her arrival. She was too quiet, too steady. She never pushed back, never advocated loudly for herself, never came to him with grievances or requests for recognition. In Holt's framework, that meant one of two things. She was either exceptionally unambitious or she was simply not sharp enough to understand how institutions worked. Either way, she registered to him as low priority. Background staff. The kind of nurse who kept wards running but would never lead anything. He'd started adding to her workload around month 3. Nothing dramatic at first. Additional inventory checks, documentation tasks that technically fell under administrative jurisdiction, the occasional request to cover a corridor that wasn't hers. Nora had done all of it without complaint, which Holt read as confirmation. She didn't push back because she couldn't see well enough to know she should. By month 8, she was routinely being assigned janitorial overflow when the cleaning staff ran short, equipment transport between buildings, and double shift coverage that other nurses quietly refused but Nora quietly accepted. The charge nurses knew it was happening. A few of them had individually considered saying something. None of them had. "She doesn't seem to mind," said Deborah Yates, the charge nurse for the surgical recovery floor, when another nurse named Patrick Solis brought it up one afternoon. "If she minded, she'd say something." "Or she's just better at this than the rest of us," Patrick said, which earned him a look that ended the conversation. The truth was that Nora did mind. She was not unbothered, and she was not oblivious. She simply operated on a principle she had carried for most of her adult life, that the best use of her energy was not fighting the wrong battles. She watched, she cataloged, she kept doing her job with the kind of precision that required concentration, and she trusted that the picture she was building, slow, careful, documented, would eventually be complete enough to mean something. What she had not accounted for was that Marcus Holt would stop thinking of her as low priority. He started thinking of her as a test case. It happened because of a staffing review in February. The hospital's new administrative board had quietly mandated a behavioral efficiency audit across department heads, and part of that audit involved evaluating how leadership handled what the report called staff integration and performance calibration. Holt had reviewed his own numbers. His department had average to low retention for nursing staff. The audit report didn't accuse him of anything specific, but the language was careful in a way that made him uncomfortable. He'd spent 3 days constructing his response, which centered on the argument that high turnover indicated rigorous standards, not management failure. The board had received his response without comment. That silence had lived in Holt's chest ever since, like a small, cold stone. He needed to demonstrate something. He needed a situation that illustrated his judgment, his leadership, his ability to read people and deploy resources effectively. He needed, in short, a controlled outcome that would photograph well on paper. The K9 rehabilitation program gave him the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Briarwood had partnered with a military working dog transition unit called the Meridian K9 Recovery Program, a federally funded initiative that placed retired service dogs in medical facility environments to support veteran therapy and post-trauma rehabilitation. The dogs spent time in the hospital, interacted with veterans recovering from injury and psychological trauma, and were assessed periodically by their handlers for continued service suitability. The current rotation included 3 dogs. Titan was the oldest, 9 years old, former explosives detection, 2 combat deployments, and a documented injury history that included a shrapnel wound to his left flank and a trauma response protocol that required experienced handling. He was not aggressive in the clinical sense, but he was what the handlers described, with deliberate understatement, as selective. He chose who he engaged with. He ignored everyone else with a completeness that felt almost contemptuous. Ranger was 7, a Belgian Malinois who had worked narcotics interdiction at 3 different forward operating bases. He was faster than Titan, more reactive, and had a particular sensitivity to elevated stress in the people around him that made him difficult to manage in chaotic environments. In calm spaces, he was almost gentle. In tense ones, he became a different animal entirely. Ghost was 6, the youngest, a mixed-breed shepherd who had been trained in personnel tracking and had completed 4 search and rescue deployments. He was quieter than the other 2, less immediately imposing, but the handlers said he was the most perceptive of the 3, the one who read rooms rather than individuals, and that when Ghost went still, it meant something in the environment had changed in a way that hadn't registered for anyone else yet. Together, the 3 dogs had a combined service record that represented the kind of operational history most people in that hospital had only read about. They were not pets. They were not props. They were retired operators who happened to be dogs, and the 2 handlers who accompanied them, senior handler Declan Marsh and his partner, Kezia Fanotti, treated them accordingly. Holt had met Marsh during the program onboarding meeting and immediately misread him. Marsh was quiet, direct, and had the particular stillness of someone who had spent many years in environments where unnecessary movement drew attention. Holt interpreted this as cooperativeness. He had begun including the K9 program in his departmental reports as evidence of innovative rehabilitation integration, without fully understanding or particularly caring about what the program actually did. What he had understood was that the dogs were difficult, and he had a use for that. The specific scenario had come to him the previous week, during a moment he wouldn't have admitted to finding satisfying. He'd been watching Nora work a supply transfer from the 4th floor storage corridor, hauling 2 equipment carts that should have had 2 people assigned to them. She hadn't said anything. She'd just done it, cart by cart, methodical and efficient, with the focused expression she wore constantly. It annoyed him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. There was something in her composure that felt to him like a refusal to acknowledge the hierarchy that organized his professional life. She was below him. She should look like she felt it. He'd gone to Marsh the next morning and pitched what he described as a staff integration assessment, an opportunity to evaluate a junior nurse's comfort and capability around the K9 program, with the goal of potentially expanding civilian staff involvement in the therapy sessions. He framed it thoughtfully. He used the right institutional language. Marsh had listened without interrupting, and then asked 2 questions: what the nurse's relevant background was, and whether she had been asked if she was willing to participate. Holt had answered the second question without answering the first. Marsh had agreed with a reservation he kept to himself. Nora was not told the full context. She was informed by way of a brief message from the department administrative coordinator that she had been assigned to assist with the K9 rehabilitation session on Thursday afternoon. No additional preparation materials, no pre-session briefing, no indication that the assignment was anything other than routine. She had read the message twice, noted the time and location in her small notebook, and gone back to work. Thursday arrived the way Thursdays always did at Briarwood, too fast and slightly understaffed. Nora had covered 3 patient handoffs before noon, assisted in a dressing change on a post-surgical veteran who kept trying to discharge himself against medical advice, and eaten half a granola bar standing in the hallway outside room 14 because there wasn't time for anything else. By the time she reached the corridor outside the K9 rehabilitation room on the hospital's ground floor, she had 12 minutes to spare and her boots were making the quiet, specific noise they made when she'd been on her feet for more than 8 hours. She stopped outside the door and read the printed sign taped to the glass panel. Meridian K9 Recovery Program, Restricted Access, Authorized Personnel Only. Through the glass, she could see the room, a wide, low-lit space with padded flooring, a few pieces of low furniture arranged to create natural rest points, and the 3 dogs arranged at different positions like they'd been placed there by someone who understood geometry. Titan was in the center. Ranger had positioned himself near the far wall. Ghost sat beside a padded bench and watched the door. Declan Marsh stood just inside, and he saw her through the glass before she knocked. He opened the door and assessed her in the quiet, professional way she recognized. The kind of look that wasn't rude, just efficient. "You're Voss," he said. "Yes." "Holt sent you over." That's what the message said. He held the door and let her in, then closed it behind them. She heard from somewhere behind her and to the right, the observation window slide open slightly. Not all the way, just enough. She did not look. Marsh crossed his arms loosely and turned so he could see both her and the dogs. "I want to be clear about something before we start. I didn't know your background when I agreed to this. Holt said this was a staff assessment, but he didn't tell me your experience level. That's on him, not you. Before anything else, have you spent time around working dogs?" Nora looked past him at Titan. Titan looked back at her. "Some time," she said. Marsh caught the way she said it. Not evasively, just precisely. He waited. She didn't offer more. He nodded once, slowly. "Okay. The protocol is simple. You stand still. You let them approach on their terms. You don't reach out. You don't make direct eye contact for longer than 2 seconds at a time, and you don't move suddenly. If Ranger gets close and his hackles go up, you call out and I'll redirect him. Titan will go first. He always goes first." "I know," Nora said. Marsh stopped. "What?" She was already looking at Titan again. "He screens first. He always has." The room very quiet. From the observation window, where Marcus Holt stood with his arms crossed and Kezia Fanotti beside him with a tablet she'd stopped typing on, nothing moved. Marsh's voice came out carefully measured. "You said he always has." "I meant working dogs like him," Nora said. "The screening behavior. It's typical of dogs with his training history." She paused. "I've read the program documentation." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and gave Titan the space to move. Titan moved. He crossed the padded floor in a slow, deliberate approach that was nothing like the cautious advance he used with new contacts. It was something else, something more direct. He stopped 18 inches from Nora and lifted his nose and took in a long, slow breath. She stood completely still. Her hands were at her sides. Her shoulders were relaxed in the particular way that took training to achieve. Not performed calm, but the real thing. The kind that came from having been in places where panic was a choice you consciously declined. Her weight was balanced. Her breathing was even. Titan exhaled through his nose. A long, low sound. Then he closed the distance and pressed his forehead against her knee. Kezia's tablet hit the windowsill. Holt's arms uncrossed. Ranger had come off the wall without anyone noticing, moving in that low, fluid way Malinois had when they were certain about something. He circled once around Nora's left side and settled close, not touching her, but within the range that the handlers called the trust perimeter, the invisible line that Ranger drew around the people he'd decided were worth protecting. Ghost hadn't moved from the bench, but he was watching her the way he watched things that mattered, with the complete unblinking attention that Kezia had learned to read as the most serious form of assessment the dog performed. Marsh stood 12 feet back and did not say a word. Nora looked down at Titan, just for a second, just long enough. "Hey," she said quietly. Not to the room, not to the observers, just to him. Titan's tail moved, once, slowly. "Hey," she said again, something in her voice that hadn't been there before. A register that was lower and steadier, and that had the faint, worn quality of something used a very long time ago and not fully put away. Holt was watching from the observation window with an expression that had started as anticipation and was now something he couldn't name. He had expected chaos. He had expected the nurse to back against the wall, to call for help, to demonstrate in front of the handlers and the program documentation and the department record that she was exactly what he believed her to be. Instead, Titan, the dog who had refused engagement with 3 hospital administrators, 2 chaplains, and a group of volunteers that included a certified dog trainer, had his forehead on her knee. "What is happening?" Holt said. Kezia didn't answer him. She was watching Marsh. Marsh hadn't moved. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his head tilted at an angle that she recognized from years of working with him. The angle that meant he was rapidly revising everything he thought he knew about a situation. Inside the room, Nora placed one hand, carefully, slowly, on Titan's head. The dog leaned into it. From somewhere in the building, an announcement crackled over the intercom. A routine patient transfer notification, the kind that played a dozen times a day. Nobody in the observation window heard it. Ranger had moved even closer now. He was sitting against her left leg. She hadn't asked him to. He had simply decided. Ghost got down from the bench. He crossed the room in that quiet way he had and sat directly in front of her, completing the triangle. The 3 dogs arranged around her in a formation that the handlers recognized from operational deployment photography, the kind of images that showed working dogs clustered around their assigned handler in high-risk environments. Marsh had seen that formation twice in 6 years. Both times, it had been with the person who had managed these dogs through their most intensive service periods. "Declan," Kezia said from the window. Her voice was very careful. "I see it," he said. She said she read the documentation. "Nobody reads the documentation like that," he said. "You know that." Holt turned to look at him through the glass. "What does that mean?" Marsh looked at the woman standing in the center of 3 retired military dogs, her hand still resting on the head of a German shepherd who had, until 40 minutes ago, refused to allow physical contact with any civilian staff member in 6 months of program operation. "It means," Marsh said slowly, "that I have some questions. The session should have ended at 4 o'clock. It ran until 4:40 because nobody wanted to be the one to break it up. Nora had settled onto the padded floor at some point. Not by design, but because Titan had slowly, incrementally shifted his weight until the most natural thing was to sit with him rather than stand over him. Ranger had arranged himself lengthwise against her right side. Ghost sat at the edge and watched the door with the focused attentiveness of a dog who had decided she was worth guarding. Marsh sat across from her on the low bench with his forearms on his knees. "Tell me what you know about Titan's deployment history," he said. Not an accusation, almost a question, the kind that already knows part of the answer. "I don't know his specific history," Nora said. "I know this type of dog, this training profile." "What kind of work?" She paused. "High-stress retrieval environments. probably explosives, based on his alert posture. He checks space before he checks people. That's a sweep first, dog. Marsh was quiet. His scar is old, she added, glancing at the healed tissue along Titan's flank. Shrapnel, not impact. He was close to the source when it happened, and he recovered fully, which means he had good medical support in the field. She looked at Marsh directly. Someone took care of him when it mattered. The observation window was still open. Holt had stopped talking 20 minutes ago. He was listening now, really listening, in the way people did when a situation had traveled so far from their expectations that the gap had become impossible to ignore. You said you've had some experience with working dogs, Marsh said. I did. That's not nursing experience. No, Nora agreed. It isn't. So what is it? She looked at Ghost, who was still watching the door. She thought about the notebook in her locker. She thought about the 43 tasks she'd completed outside her job description in the past 11 months. She thought about the supply inventory she'd been running twice a week without additional compensation because someone had to catch the discrepancies. And she thought about the quiet, careful way she had been building a record that said something about this hospital that needed to be said. She thought about what she had not yet decided to say out loud. I should get back to my floor, she said finally. I have a patient transfer at 5. Marsh didn't push it. He stood when she stood and watched her give each dog one last quiet acknowledgement. Not a goodbye exactly, more like a sign-off, the kind that passed between people who expected to see each other again. She paused at the door. They should be getting protein supplements with their current recovery load, she said without turning around. If they're doing extended engagement sessions twice a week, their caloric intake from the program meals isn't sufficient, Ghost especially. He's running slightly lean for his size. She left. The door closed. Marsh stood in the center of the room with 3 dogs and the particular silence that follows when something unexpected has happened and no one has yet decided what to do about it. He turned to the observation window. Holt was still there. His expression had completed its journey from anticipation through confusion and arrived somewhere Marsh couldn't quite categorize. Not embarrassment, not respect. Something in between, with a harder edge underneath. Who is she? Marsh asked through the glass. Holt didn't answer immediately. She's a level 2 nurse, he said finally. She's been assigned to trauma and surgical recovery. That's not what I asked. Holt's jaw tightened. It's what I know. What Holt did next said more about him than everything that had come before. He didn't go to Nora's floor manager. He didn't request a file review or ask HR for her full employment and background record. He didn't do the thing that any administrator with genuine institutional concern would have done, which was to simply ask her, directly and professionally, what her background actually was. Instead, he went back to his office, sat down at his desk, and tried to figure out what had gone wrong with his plan. He wasn't thinking about the hospital. He wasn't thinking about the K9 program. He was thinking about the fact that the situation he had designed to produce a specific, convenient outcome had produced a completely different one, and that somewhere in that building was a woman who had just made him look uninformed in front of a federal program coordinator. He called the administrative coordinator at 5:15 and assigned Nora to extended overnight documentation duty for the following week, covering 2 departments, both of which had their own assigned documentation staff. He didn't frame it as punishment. He never did. He framed it as resource allocation. Patrick Solis heard about the K9 session from Kezia Fanoti, who had found him in the break room on the 2nd floor and told him about it in the low, urgent tone of someone delivering information that hasn't yet found its proper category. She sat down with all 3 of them, Kezia said. Titan put his head in her lap. Patrick set down his coffee. Titan. The dog who bit the regional coordinator. The same dog. Patrick looked at the ceiling for a moment. Does Marsh know who she is? He knows she isn't what she said she was. What did she say she was? She said she'd read the documentation. Patrick laughed, a short, involuntary sound that had nothing to do with humor. Right. He picked up his coffee again. Nobody at this hospital has read the documentation. I'm not sure I've read the documentation. Declan sent a message to the program office, Kezia said. He's asking for a case review, something about a handler identification protocol. She shook her head. He wouldn't tell me exactly what that means, but he looked like someone had just handed him a piece of evidence in a case he'd closed. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Does Holt know? Holt was watching through the observation window. So, yes. Patrick set the coffee down again. He wouldn't be drinking it anyway. What did Holt do after? Kezia's expression answered the question before she did. He doubled her documentation assignment. Patrick closed his eyes briefly. Of course he did. Nora finished her shift at 7:18, 4 minutes over, which was better than most days. She'd changed her boots at her locker. One of the laces had finally given up, and sat for a moment on the bench, her small notebook open to the page she'd been keeping for the past 11 months. The list was long, neat. Each entry dated, specific, professional in the way she had learned to be professional long before nursing. She turned to a fresh page and wrote 4 things. K9 session, 3:10-4:40 p.m. 3 dogs. Sweep first. Stress reactive, perimeter, and track. Formation response, full cluster. Handler, D. Marsh, Sr. Observation, M. Holt, Director. She paused, then added a 5th line. Protein deficiency noted. Ghost. Will flag through program documentation channel. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag and walked to the parking structure in the cooling Nevada evening, past the desert scrub that grew in the median and the lights of Harlan coming on in the distance. She was halfway to her car when her phone buzzed. An email. Briarwood Administrative System. New assignment notification. She read the overnight documentation scope. Both departments. 7 nights. She stood in the parking structure with the concrete smell and the distant hum of traffic and read the assignment twice, the way she always read things twice, and then she wrote the date and assignment in her notebook and put both away. She had expected something like this. Not the specific form, but the shape of it. The response that disguised itself as protocol. She had been cataloging those for a long time too. What she had not expected was the second notification, which arrived 40 seconds later. It was from a different sender, an address she didn't recognize, government formatted, military adjacent, with a domain suffix that made something in her chest tighten the way it hadn't tightened in 2 years. The subject line read, Meridian K9 Program, Handler Verification Request. She read the message once. Then she stood very still in the concrete stairwell with the evening light coming through the grated window and thought about the last time she had received a message like that. The last time anyone in that particular chain had reached back to her, and what it had taken and what it had cost, and what she had decided afterward about the life she was building now and the things she was prepared to let herself become again. She didn't write anything in the notebook. She put her phone in her pocket and walked the rest of the way to her car. And when she got in, she sat for a long moment with her hands on the wheel before she started the engine. 3 dogs in a triangle, a formation she hadn't seen in 2 years. And someone, somewhere in the Meridian program chain, had just looked at the session footage and recognized what Declan Marsh had already started to understand. She drove home through the Nevada dark with the message still unread in her pocket, and the notebook closed in her bag, and the quiet, settled knowledge that the life she had carefully arranged around anonymity and routine was about to become something else entirely, whether she chose it or not. She didn't open the message that night. She made dinner, rice, canned fish, whatever was left in the refrigerator that didn't require decisions, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like committing to something. Her apartment was small and deliberately sparse. A couch she'd owned for 5 years, a bookshelf that held mostly field manuals and one novel she'd never finished, and a kitchen table that functioned primarily as a secondary desk. She had no photographs on the walls. She had no photographs anywhere. It wasn't a statement. It was just how she had arranged things when she'd moved to Harlan, and she hadn't had a reason to change it since. She washed the single dish and set it in the rack and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below. A quiet residential block that smelled like warm asphalt and cut grass in the evenings. And thought about the Meridian program. About Declan Marsh's face through the observation window. About the way Ghost had positioned himself at the door with that absolute final attentiveness. She thought about what a handler verification request actually meant in the program's operational structure. It wasn't a routine administrative inquiry. The Meridian K9 recovery program ran its records through a channel that intersected with 3 separate federal databases. And a handler verification request meant someone had submitted a match flag, a behavioral or biometric signature from the session footage that had been checked against program records and returned a possible identification. It meant someone thought they recognized her. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The message stayed unread until morning. What? She opened it at 6:14 a.m., sitting on the edge of her bed with her phone and the gray light coming through the blinds. The message was from a Major Lena Grayfield, Program Oversight Coordinator for the Meridian K9 Recovery Initiative, Western Region. It was professional, brief, and careful in the way that military-adjacent correspondence was always careful, giving you just enough information to understand that more was known than was being stated. Ms. Voss, your engagement with the Meridian K9 program on Thursday prompted a routine handler verification inquiry. Our records indicate a possible background alignment with program history. We would appreciate the opportunity to speak at your earliest convenience. This is not an administrative concern. Please contact the number below at your discretion. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the bed and sat with her hands in her lap for a moment. Not an administrative concern. That phrasing was doing a lot of work. She picked the phone back up and wrote the contact number in her notebook. Then she got dressed, laced her new boots. The lace on the left was already fraying, which said something about the quality of hospital supply chain procurement that she'd been documenting for 4 months, and drove to Briarwood for a 7 a.m. shift start. She did not call the number. Not yet. The first thing she noticed when she arrived was that someone had moved the supply cart from the corridor outside trauma recovery to a position that partially blocked the medication room door. It was the kind of thing that happened at shift changes when the outgoing staff was tired and the incoming staff hadn't started caring yet. She moved it herself before the charge nurse arrived and wrote the time and position in her notebook out of habit. The second thing she noticed was that Dr. Marcus Holt was already in the building. He was usually in by 8. 7:20 was unusual. She noticed his car in the reserved section of the parking structure from the window of the third-floor corridor, which was the same window she used to check weather in the mornings because the building's internal systems ran an hour behind actual conditions, and she'd learned not to trust the digital displays. She noted the arrival time in her notebook without attributing significance to it. She was still building the picture. The shift was busy in the way Friday shifts were always busy. A combination of patients trying to be discharged before the weekend and new admissions who had been holding out all week and finally stopped holding. She handled a post-surgical veteran named Ellis Garmond who had decided overnight that his pain was manageable enough to remove his own drainage tube, which it was not, and she spent 40 minutes in his room working through the situation with him in the tone she used for people who were not wrong to be frustrated but were making things worse for themselves. "You do this in the military?" he asked her at some point. He was 61, retired Army, with the kind of directness that came from a lifetime of environments where indirectness was dangerous. "Do what?" "Talk people down from bad ideas." She adjusted the new dressing and didn't answer immediately. "I've had some practice." He studied her the way people who'd been in certain environments studied people, quickly, categorically, with the particular attention that went beyond surface. "You serve?" "I was a medic for a while," she said. "Hold still." He held still, but he kept looking at her. "Which branch?" "Navy." He was quiet for a moment. "Special assignment?" She taped the edge of the dressing and straightened. "The tube needs to stay in for another 36 hours. I'll check it again this evening." He let it go. But when she reached the door, he said, "The dogs, right? I heard you were with the K9 unit yesterday." She stopped, turned. "Where did you hear that?" "Hospital," he said, as if that explained everything, which, at Briarwood, it mostly did. She nodded once and went back to her floor. By 10:30, she had heard the story of the K9 session from 3 different sources, each with escalating embellishment. By the time it reached the version Patrick Solis repeated to her during a brief overlap at the medication station, Titan had apparently walked to her from across the room and sat at her feet before she'd even fully entered the door. "That's not what happened," Nora said. "I know," Patrick said. "But the version that actually happened isn't that different from the embellished one, and that's kind of the point." He handed her a chart. "Holt's been in 2 closed-door meetings this morning, both with administration." "About what?" "Don't know. Kezia tried to find out from the facilities coordinator, but Holt's assistant has been told not to pull walkaway records from the meeting room system." He leaned slightly closer. "Which is a thing you only do if you know someone will check." Nora filed that. "He also submitted a supplemental staffing note this morning," Patrick said. "I shouldn't know this, but I do. It reclassifies your overnight documentation assignment as a standing weekly rotation rather than a temporary reallocation. She processed that without any visible reaction. Starting when? Next Monday. Standing weekly rotation meant it wouldn't auto-expire. It meant it would require a formal reclassification request to remove. It meant Holt had moved from inconveniencing her to attempting to permanently restructure her schedule in a way that made her role look like something it wasn't. "Okay," she said. Patrick looked at her. "That's it? Okay. What would you prefer?" He gestured vaguely. "I don't know, something. He's rewriting your assignment profile to justify the extra workload. That's not allocation. It's a paper trail, Nora. He's building a case." "I know," she said. "So am I." She took the chart and went back to work. Declan Marsh arrived at the hospital at 11:45, which was not a scheduled program day. He came in through the main entrance, signed in at reception, and went directly to the K9 rehabilitation room where Kezia was running a shorter session with the dogs and a group of 3 veterans from the inpatient psychiatric unit. The veterans were having a better morning than most of them usually did. Ghost had that effect on rooms, the quiet settling one, the way a thermometer dropped in a fever ward. Marsh pulled Kezia aside while one of the veterans scratched Ranger behind the ears with the specific relief of someone doing something simple and true for the first time in days. "I got the call from Grayfield," Marsh said, low. Kezia's posture changed. "The program coordinator?" Major Grayfield ran the session footage through the handler identification system. He looked at the door. "Got a partial match." "Partial." The system flagged a behavioral profile from a 2019 operational series. Handler designations from a joint SOCOM Navy attachment. He paused. "The full record's restricted. Even I don't have clearance to access it directly." Kezia thought about this. "But Grayfield does." "Grayfield does." And Grayfield sent an inquiry to the nurse. Voss. He said the name carefully. "Last night." "Did she respond?" "Not yet." He folded his arms. "But here's what Grayfield told me. The 2019 operational attachment, the one the behavioral profile is matched to, worked with 3 dogs. Different names. Different records than ours, because they were active service designation. But the handling signatures are the same." He let that sit for a moment. Titan, Ranger, and Ghost weren't always called that. They got their current names when they transitioned to the recovery program. Kezia looked at the dogs across the room. At Ghost, who had moved to sit beside a veteran who'd been having a hard morning, pressing his weight gently against the man's knee. "She worked with them before," she said. Not a question. "We think so." He exhaled slowly. The behavioral formation from yesterday's session was a re-recognition response. All 3 dogs did it simultaneously, without cueing. That doesn't happen with a stranger. That happens when someone comes back. Kezia was quiet for a long moment. "Does Holt know any of this?" Marsh's expression was answer enough. "He was in the observation room." "He saw the session," Marsh said. "He doesn't know what it means. And right now, I'm less concerned about Holt than I am about why a person with that kind of background is working a level 2 nursing position at a mid-tier veterans hospital and apparently being assigned to move supply carts." The afternoon brought a new admission to surgical recovery. A 34-year-old active-duty soldier named Purvat Tomas Arrieta, transferred from the base hospital 40 miles north after a training accident that had left him with a fractured radius, 3 cracked ribs, and a head laceration that had looked worse than it was, but had scared everyone appropriately. He came in quiet and stayed quiet, which Nora recognized as a particular kind of response. Not shock, not pain management, just the trained compression of someone who'd learned not to show things in front of witnesses. She ran his initial vitals, reviewed the transfer documentation, and was checking the surgical notes when he said, without looking at her, "You're the one from the dog thing." She didn't look up from the chart. "News travels." "Base hospital's got people here," he said. "Word came over this morning. They said a nurse here made Titan sit." She finished reading the notes and looked at him directly. He was younger than she'd expected from the record, with the specific kind of tiredness in his face that didn't come from the injury, but from whatever the injury had interrupted. "How do you know Titan's name?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I know the program. I know what those dogs are." He shifted slightly, winced, controlled it. Titan was a working asset at Kobar deployment before he aged out. I was there for 3 weeks on a joint rotation. She wrote something in the chart. The senior handler at Briarwood sent an inquiry to our base command this morning, Arietta said, through the handler verification channel. Nora's pen stopped moving. Base commander forwarded it to the JAG office, he continued. I don't know exactly why, but they escalated it fast. Usually those inquiries take weeks. He looked at the ceiling. Took about 6 hours. She set this pen down. Who told you this? My CO called when I was in intake. He paused. He said to tell you that the channel's been acknowledged, whatever that means. She understood exactly what it meant. I need to run your fluid balance check, she said. It'll take about 10 minutes. He nodded and didn't say anything else, but when she finished and went to leave, he said, They take care of those dogs here? She looked back at him. Marsh does. Yes. Good, he said simply, and closed his eyes. She called the number at 4:50 p.m. from the stairwell between the second and third floors, which had bad cell reception everywhere except the landing, and which nobody used because it smelled like old paint and the fire exit alarm had been intermittently malfunctioning for 3 months. Major Lena Grayfield picked up on the second ring. Ms. Voss. Her voice was steady and clipped in the way of someone used to calls that needed to cover a lot of ground quickly. Thank you for reaching out. You said it wasn't an administrative concern. It isn't. Then what is it? A brief pause. Not hesitation, consideration. We identified your behavioral signature in yesterday's session footage, cross-referenced against the handler profiles from Operation Greywater 2019. You were attached to the forward medical unit as a Navy SARC medic. Nora said nothing. The dogs were designated Kestrel, Sable, and Dusk at the time, Grayfield continued. They were transferred to the Meridian Recovery Program 2 years later under new designations. Their handler history was compartmentalized as part of the transition, standard protocol for SOCOM-adjacent assets. I know the protocol, Nora said. Then you know that a re-recognition response of the kind your session produced is a significant data point. The program has a welfare obligation to document it. Another pause. But that's not the primary reason I contacted you. Nora waited. There's a secondary inquiry running, Grayfield said carefully. Not from our office. From outside the program. It concerns procurement records at Briarwood Veterans Medical Center, specifically the supply chain documentation for the K9 program's equipment and medical supply requisitions over the past 14 months. Something went very still in Nora's chest. The inquiry was initiated by a federal audit flag, Grayfield said, routine on the surface, but the audit pulled a pattern that doesn't correspond to any standard deviation model. Supply orders that were fulfilled on paper but can't be physically accounted for. Equipment logged as delivered that the program's on-site records don't show. She stopped. Someone's been running a systematic skimming operation through the program's supply channel. Small enough amounts to stay under threshold review, consistent enough to add up. Nora looked at the painted concrete wall of the stairwell. The audit flagged the pattern 7 weeks ago, Grayfield said. The flag went to the Regional Oversight Office. The Regional Oversight Office is where it stopped. Another deliberate pause, which suggests the problem isn't just in the supply chain. Someone in oversight is covering it, Nora said. That's the working theory. Why are you telling me this? Because the on-site documentation records that would confirm or disprove the pattern, the original supply logs, the unprocessed intake records, those are maintained by whoever is assigned to inventory documentation at Briarwood. A beat. And according to hospital records, that assignment has recently been expanded significantly. The overnight documentation rotation, both departments, the standing weekly assignment that Holt had submitted that morning. The picture she had been building for 11 months suddenly had a center. He gave me the assignment, Nora said slowly, because he needed someone reliable to process the documentation. Someone who follows instructions without pushing back, Grayfield said. Someone who wouldn't ask questions. He thought I was exactly that. Yes. She leaned against the concrete wall and looked at nothing for a moment. 11 months of supply inventory inconsistencies, of equipment manifests that didn't quite line up, of the quiet habitual discrepancies she'd been logging in her notebook without fully understanding why they mattered, just trusting that they did. The audit can't access the raw documentation without a formal federal request, Grayfield said, which requires either a whistleblower complaint or a chain of custody transfer through a verified personnel file. A federal request takes time. 3 to 6 weeks on the standard track, longer if the regional oversight delay continues. And the skimming? Continues in the meantime. At current rates, the projected loss from program funding reaches a threshold that triggers mandatory suspension of operations within 8 weeks. A pause that was not casual, which means the dogs get pulled. Titan, Ranger, Ghost, the veterans in the inpatient psychiatric unit. The man that morning with his hand on Ranger's back. Tomas Arrieta asking if they were taken care of. I have documentation, Nora said. I know, Grayfield said. That's the other reason I called. She took the stairwell all the way down to the ground floor and stood outside the building in the late afternoon heat, which hit her the way Nevada heat always did. Immediate and total, as if the air itself had made a decision. The scrub beyond the parking structure was turning gold in the low light. A pair of ravens worked the dumpster enclosure near the maintenance building with the frank efficiency of birds who understood institutional environments. She went through what she had, 14 months of supply logs. Not complete, she'd only been assigned to inventory documentation for 11, and even then it had been a partial rotation for the first 4 months. But what she had was dated, specific, and organized in exactly the way the federal audit would need it to be. Itemized, cross-referenced, and consistent with the kind of documentation protocol she'd been trained to maintain a long time before she ever worked in a hospital. The question was how to get it into the right hands without triggering the very mechanism that had been suppressing the audit flag. If she submitted through the hospital's internal reporting structure, it went to Holt's administrative chain first. If she submitted through the Meridian program directly, it stayed within the documentation channel that Grayfield had just told her was compromised at the regional level. She needed a lateral path, something that went around both. She was still working through it when her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. Text message. Unknown number. 2 words and a building identifier. Ground floor. Now. She looked up. Declan Marsh was standing at the corner of the building, 30 feet away, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the particular look of a man who has been connecting dots all day and has just arrived at a count that troubles him seriously. Beside him was a woman in civilian clothes that fit the way. Civilian clothes always fit on people who spent most of their time in uniform. Slightly wrong, slightly deliberately chosen to communicate that they were off duty, while their posture communicated they were never quite off duty. She was Nora's height, maybe a year older, with close-cropped natural hair and the precise, evaluative eyes of someone who had built a career on reading things that weren't in any report. Marsh gestured toward the woman. Major Grayfield, he said. She was already on her way when she called you. Grayfield looked at Nora directly. I didn't fly in for the supply chain audit, she said. I flew in because the handler verification flag triggered a secondary protocol from a SOCOM welfare office. Behavioral re-recognition of a Navy SARC asset. That's a Category 2 flag. It escalated before I even read the email. Nora held her gaze. What does a Category 2 flag mean in practical terms? It means, Grayfield said, that whoever you were before you started telling people you read the documentation, those records are still active, and active records have active obligations. The evening wind came across the parking structure, dry and warm and smelling of hot asphalt and whatever desert was left at the edges of Harlan. The ravens had moved on. The lot was thinning out as the shift change completed. I left that life, Nora said. Yes, Grayfield said. And you went very quietly and very deliberately, and you built something here that looks like a person who decided to be small. She glanced at Marsh briefly, then back. But you've been running a documentation audit for over a year on a hospital that's siphoning federal program funds, and you didn't report it through any official channel. That's not someone who wanted to be small. She tilted her head. That's someone who was building a case. Nora didn't confirm it. Grayfield didn't need her to. The problem, the major said, is that the case you've been building needs to move now, not in 6 weeks, not through the standard audit channel, because in 6 weeks the operational funding threshold hits suspension criteria and the program terminates. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card with a second number handwritten on the back. The JAG office that your patient's CO contacted this morning. They're running a parallel investigation into the regional oversight failure. They need a source document chain, Something that bypasses the compromised channel. They want my notebook, Nora said. They want everything in it. She looked at the card for a moment. Then she looked at the building behind her, the blocky, sand-colored complex where she had spent 2 years carrying equipment, processing documentation, running double shifts, and quietly recording every discrepancy in a handwritten notebook that no one had ever thought to ask about because nobody had ever thought she was doing anything more than following instructions. Holt thinks he assigned me to that documentation rotation so I'd process the falsified records without noticing, she said. Yes. He doesn't know I've been tracking the inconsistencies since before he extended the assignment. No. He handed me the complete picture. He handed you, Grayfield said carefully, the rope. From the 3rd floor of this building, through a window that caught the evening light and turned it amber, a figure was visible at a desk. Just the silhouette, but she recognized the height and the set of his shoulders and the particular posture of someone who believed that what they controlled could not be taken from them. She looked at Grayfield. How long do you need to get Jag on site? They're already in Harlan, Grayfield said. Have been since this morning. The Ravens were back. One of them had found something in the scrub near the parking structure perimeter and was working at it with single-minded focus, and the other stood slightly behind it in the particular posture of a bird that had learned patience. Nora looked at the card, at the building, at Marsh, who had said nothing through all of this and whose silence was the specific kind that came from someone who had already decided what side he was on. Monday, she said. He extended the rotation starting Monday. Yes, Grayfield said. He'll expect me to begin processing the documentation Monday morning. Yes. And if I begin processing it instead through the JAG chain of custody, then Monday becomes something else entirely, Grayfield said. Nora folded the card and put it in her pocket, next to the notebook. The window on the 3rd floor went dark, and somewhere inside the hospital, in the rehabilitation room on the ground floor, 3 dogs that had once worked in the dark alongside people who made decisions that could not be undone heard something shift in the building's quiet, a change so small it wouldn't register on any instrument, and Titan lifted his head from the padded floor and looked at the door for a long moment before settling again, with the patience of a dog who had spent a career learning to wait for the right moment. The weekend passed the way weekends at Briarwood always did, slower on the surface, faster underneath, with the particular institutional tension of a place that never fully stopped but pretended to slow down for appearances. Nora worked both days. She hadn't requested the weekend shifts, but they appeared on her updated schedule Friday evening, slotted in without a note or explanation, and she took them the way she took everything Holt sent her way, without comment, without complaint, and with the notebook open. She used the time. Saturday morning, she arrived at 6:40 and spent the first hour before patient rounds doing something she had been doing incrementally for 11 months, cross-referencing the inventory intake logs from the Meridian K9 program supply requisitions against the hospital's central receiving manifests. The discrepancy pattern she had identified 4 months ago had a specific signature, orders fulfilled on paper, logged as received and processed, but physically absent from the program's actual supply inventory. The amounts were small, consistently small. Medical-grade nutritional supplements for the dogs, veterinary specification wound care materials, 2 categories of equipment, maintenance parts that had serial number tracking but no corresponding physical check-in records, small enough that a casual reviewer would attribute it to clerical error. Too consistent, over too many months, to be anything of the kind. She had the complete picture now, or close enough. The pattern ran back 14 months. She had direct documentation for 11. The 3 she was missing were from the period before Holt had begun expanding her assignment, when the documentation rotation had gone through a different staff member, a part-time administrative worker named Ruth Ann Pauley, who had left Briarwood 8 months ago for a position at a private clinic 40 miles away. Nora had not yet figured out whether Pauley had noticed the pattern and left because of it, or whether Pauley had been part of it and left because the next phase of the operation required distance. That distinction mattered. She had noted it 3 weeks ago and flagged it in the notebook with a small asterisk, her standard marker for things that needed resolution before the picture was complete. She called the number on Grayfield's card at 7:15, before rounds, from the same stairwell. The person who answered was not Grayfield. Special Agent Dwight Okafor, the voice said. Flat, professional, alert for 7 in the morning. Your Voss. Yes. Major Grayfield briefed us last night. We've been waiting for your call. A brief pause that contained the sound of something being opened. A folder, maybe, or a laptop. You have documentation. I have 11 months of supply cross-references in a handwritten notebook. I also have 3 months of supplemental intake logs that I photographed before they were processed through the central system and overwritten. Those are on my phone. A silence that was not empty. You photographed the intake logs, Okafor said, before processing. Yes. When did you start doing that? Month 4, she said, when I noticed the overwrite pattern. Another silence. Ms. Voss, I need to ask you something directly. Did you approach this documentation process as a nurse performing assigned duties or as someone conducting an independent investigation? She understood the question. The answer mattered for chain of custody. I performed every assigned duty completely and on schedule, she said. The documentation I maintained was supplemental, personal records of professional observations. I didn't alter any hospital records, interfere with any official process, or access any system beyond my assigned authorization level. The photographs were taken on my personal phone during my assigned duty period of documents I was authorized to handle as part of my job function. She paused. I can provide timestamps. A pause. Then, we need to meet today. I'm on shift until 3. After 3 then, Major Grayfield will be present. A beat. Don't process anything in the documentation system before we meet. Don't alter your schedule in any visible way. And Ms. Voss, don't tell anyone about this call. I haven't told anyone about anything, she said. That's how I've lasted 11 months. She met them at 4:15 in a conference room at a mid-range hotel 4 blocks from the hospital. The kind of room that existed specifically for meetings that needed to be off-site without looking like they were hiding. Okafor was a compact man in his mid-40s with a federal posture and civilian clothes that were marginally better chosen than Grayfield's. He had a partner named Special Agent Rosa Villarreal, who took notes without appearing to take notes, and who Nora spent the first 10 minutes trying to read before deciding she was not going to succeed at that in an afternoon. Grayfield sat at the corner of the table, slightly back from the main axis of the conversation, in the position of someone who had convened a meeting and was now watching it run. Nora put the notebook on the table. Okafor looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it and read in silence for longer than she expected. This is organized, he said finally. Yes. These cross-reference columns, you built this system yourself. I adapted a tracking format I used previously. Different context, same structural logic. He looked up. Previous military context. Yes. He looked back at the notebook. The Ruth Ann Pauley gap. You flagged this. I need to know whether she was involved or whether she was a witness who left. We know where Pauley is, Villarreal said, without looking up from whatever she was doing that wasn't noticeably note-taking. We've been aware of her since the audit flag triggered. She contacted our office 6 weeks ago. A brief pause. Anonymously. But we identified her. Nora absorbed this. She witnessed it. She noticed a discrepancy in month 3, brought it to Holt directly. And she was reassigned within the week, and her contract was not renewed. Villarreal finally looked up. She left Briarwood and made an anonymous tip, and then decided she was done. She has a family. She made a calculation. Nora understood that calculation. She had watched people make versions of it her entire career. Pauley's tip was what triggered the initial audit flag, Okafor said. But the flag went through the regional oversight office before it reached us, and someone in that office killed it, buried it in a procedural review category that has no mandatory escalation timeline. He closed the notebook carefully. We've been trying to reconstruct the documentation chain ever since. Pauley's tip gave us the pattern. What she couldn't give us was the physical evidence. He pushed the notebook back across the table toward her. Then he looked at her steadily. What you have here, Ms. Voss, cross-referenced, dated, and consistent with the physical inventory discrepancies our audit identified. This is the chain. This is what we need to make the case airtight. He paused. The question is how we access the complete documentation record without alerting whoever in the oversight office is running interference. You can't go through the hospital's official records system, Nora said. Holt will see a federal access request before it processes. We know. And you can't use the Meridian program's own documentation channel for the same reason. Also no. So you need someone inside the hospital to pull the physical documentation, she said. The original intake logs, the paper versions, before they're digitized and overwritten. Those are stored in the administrative records room on sub-level 1. She looked at Okafor. I'm assigned to documentation for both departments starting Monday. I will be in that room. This conference room was quiet for a moment. We can't ask you to do that, Grayfield said from her corner. You're not asking, Nora said. I'm telling you what I'm already positioned to do. She looked at the notebook on the table. He put me there because he thought I was the kind of person who wouldn't understand what she was looking at. He was wrong. She paused. I want to finish what I started. Okafor and Villarreal exchanged a look that was brief and complete, the communication of people who had worked together long enough to have entire conversations in a glance. Monday, Okafor said, you process the documentation exactly as assigned. You pull the original paper logs from the physical records as part of your normal duty. You will be wearing a body camera, small, concealed, department-approved design that won't register on a standard facility security scan. He put both hands flat on the table. If at any point Holt or anyone connected to him becomes aware of what you're doing, you stop. You don't push through. You walk out of the room and you call this number. He slid a new card across. Are we clear? Clear, she said. She picked up the notebook and the card and put them both in her bag and stood up. Grayfield stood with her and walked her to the door, and at the door she said quietly, so only Nora could hear it. The dogs go to a federal holding facility if the program suspends. Tightened stress response in isolation environments. You know what that looks like. Nora did know. Monday, she said, and went back out into the Nevada evening. Sunday was a different kind of hard. She did her shift, which was quieter than Saturday, but in the way that preceded something rather than followed it. She checked on Tomas Arrieta, whose fractures were progressing correctly and whose color was better, and who looked at her when she came in with the particular awareness of someone who had been told something and was deciding how much it mattered. You good? He asked. Running vitals, she said. Hold still. He held still. Then, whatever's happening, the JAG thing, I want you to know that word at the base is good. My CO's got people paying attention. She wrote the BP reading and didn't respond. That's not nothing, he said. I know, she said. Thank you. She also checked the K9 rehabilitation room, not because she had any official reason to, but because she found herself at the ground floor corridor at a natural transition between tasks, and it was simply the direction she walked. The room was dark and locked. She stood at the glass and could see the padded floor and the low furniture and the empty space where 3 dogs had arranged themselves around her like they were restoring something that had been interrupted. She put her hand flat on the glass for a moment. Then she went back to work. Monday arrived at 5 a.m. when her alarm went off, and she lay in the dark of her apartment for 4 minutes before getting up, which was 3 minutes longer than usual. She made coffee. She dressed. She laced her boots, the left ones still fraying. She'd have to replace them this week. And she drove to Briarwood with the card in her shirt pocket and the notebook in her bag and the body camera in its concealed housing clipped to the inside of her lanyard, exactly where Okafor's contact had shown her the previous afternoon in a parking garage 2 miles from the hospital. The administrative records room on sub-level 1 was accessed through a corridor that connected to basement infrastructure, electrical, HVAC, central supply storage. It was not a room that most nursing staff ever visited. It smelled like old paper and recycled air and the particular institutional staleness of a space that got cleaned twice a month, whether it needed it or not. Nora had been down here 4 times in 11 months. Each time, she had found the paper intake logs stacked in chronological order in a set of standard fireproof storage cabinets against the far wall. They were organized by department and quarter, labeled in the administrative shorthand she'd learned to read quickly. MRP for Meridian Recovery Program, followed by the fiscal quarter designation and the document batch number. She had 45 minutes before anyone would expect her upstairs. She moved through the room efficiently, starting at the correct cabinet, pulling the correct files, and working from oldest to newest. 14 months of paper intake logs. The physical originals that existed before the digitization process overwrote the detail in the electronic record. The body camera ran continuously. She handled each document with the deliberate, even movements of someone who had been trained to manage evidence in environments where careless handling destroyed things that couldn't be reconstructed. 22 minutes in, she found what she had suspected was there. In Q3 of the previous fiscal year, the period she had flagged but hadn't been able to document, there were 2 intake logs that had been altered, not clumsily. Whoever had done it had some familiarity with records management. The alterations were made in the same pen, same pressure, consistent with the rest of the document at a glance. But the document batch numbers didn't correlate correctly with the fiscal quarter sequence, which was the kind of detail that required knowing the system rather than just looking at the form. She photographed both documents with the body camera, then continued through the remaining files. She was on the last cabinet when the door to the records room opened. She did not turn immediately. She closed the cabinet drawer she was working from, made a note in the margin of the duty log she was technically supposed to be completing, and then turned around. It was not who she expected. The woman standing in the doorway was the hospital's chief administrative officer, Diane Pressler, 58, a compact figure who managed the hospital's non-clinical operations with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 20 years and intended to do it for 20 more. She was not, as far as Nora had been able to determine, connected to the procurement irregularities. She was also not someone who came to sub-level records rooms at 7:30 in the morning. She was looking at Nora with an expression that was complicated. "Ms. Voss," she said. "Miss Pressler." Nora kept her voice level. "I'm running the documentation rotation for both departments, Dr. Holt's assignment." "I know what the assignment is." Pressler came into the room and let the door close behind her. She looked at the open duty log, at the cabinets, at Nora. "I need to ask you something directly." "All right. How long have you known?" The question sat in the middle of the room between them. Nora looked at her steadily. "Known what, specifically?" "Don't." Pressler's voice was not unkind, but it had lost whatever professional distance it had started with. "I've been the CAO of this facility for 9 years. I know every supply chain that runs through this building. I know the Meridian program accounts. I know what the quarterly reconciliation should look like, and I know what it has looked like for the past 14 months. She pressed her lips together. I have been trying to build a case through legitimate channels for 4 of those months. Holt controls enough of the documentation chain that every time I get close, something gets reclassified or rerouted. Nora said nothing. He put you on the documentation rotation, Pressler said. When I saw the extended assignment he submitted Friday, I hoped that you had noticed something, because you are the only person in this facility who has been consistently assigned across the supply and records documentation without being part of Holt's administrative network. A pause. I don't know your background, Pressler said. I don't know what those dogs in the rehabilitation room recognized in you, and I don't know why a federal handler verification flag went active last week, and why there are 2 people with federal credentials who checked into the Marriott on 5th Street Friday night. Her eyes were direct and tired in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time in the wrong direction. But I know that whatever you've been doing in this room this morning is not routine documentation processing. Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and put the notebook on the records table between them. Pressler looked at it. She opened the first page. She read in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere above them, the hospital was running its morning operations. The intercom, the cartwheels on linoleum, the specific white noise of an institution moving through its functions. Down here it was just the 2 of them, and the hum and the years of records in the cabinets, and a notebook that contained 11 months of careful, quiet work. There are federal agents already in contact, Nora said. The documentation I've pulled this morning is going through a JAG-adjacent chain that bypasses the Regional Oversight Office. Pressler closed the notebook. That's why the regional channel failed. She said it as a realization, not a question. Someone in regional oversight is protecting Holt. Working theory, supported by the audit delay pattern. Pressler set the notebook down on the table and was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? Access to the Q3 batch logs from fiscal year prior, Nora said. The full set. The batch numbers I have don't correlate. I think there are supplementary documents filed under a secondary code. I don't have authorization for that cabinet. Pressler reached into her jacket pocket and produced a key card. She held it out. Nora took it. They worked together for the next 18 minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Two people focused on a specific task, each bringing something the other didn't have. Pressler knew the secondary filing system and found the correlating documents in 6 minutes. Nora identified the 3 additional altered records in 3 more. By the time they were done, the picture was complete. Every quarter, every fraudulent entry, every supply order that had been logged as received and never physically arrived. It added up to a number that, when Nora wrote it in the margin of her duty log, made Pressler exhale very slowly through her nose. 14 months, Pressler said. Yes. And the regional office buried it. For at least 7 weeks. Possibly longer. Pressler looked at the wall of cabinets, at the history of a system that had been trusted and used against the people it was supposed to serve. Then she looked at Nora. You've been here 2 years and 4 months. Yes. And you started documenting in month 4. Yes? Because you noticed something. Because I notice things, Nora said simply. It's what I do. Pressler studied her for a moment with the expression of someone revising a significant portion of what they thought they knew. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I was aware that Holt had been adding to your workload. I should have intervened sooner. You were building your own case, Nora said, with fewer tools and more exposure. That's generous. It's accurate. Nora picked up the notebook and put it back in her bag. I need to make a call. I need to do it now. Go, Pressler said. She was in the stairwell at 8:12 a.m. when Okafor answered on the first ring. We're done downstairs, she said. I have everything, including the Q3 supplementals and 3 additional altered documents. She paused. CAO Diane Pressler assisted. She's been running a parallel internal investigation for 4 months. She's clean. I'd stake the documentation on it. Understood. A pause on his end, the sound of a room adjusting. There's a development. She waited. Holt submitted an emergency HR flagging action this morning at 7:52 a.m., Okafor said. Filed against you. Alleges unauthorized records access, conduct unbecoming, and misrepresentation of credentials in a federal program context. She absorbed this. 7:52, 14 minutes after she'd entered the records room. He knew I was down there, she said. Camera in the sub-level corridor, standard facility security. He was monitoring it remotely. Okafor's voice was controlled. Ms. Voss, the flagging action creates a formal basis to suspend your hospital access credentials. Under Briarwood's HR protocol, a suspension can be executed within 2 hours of filing, she said. I know the protocol. That gives us until approximately 10 a.m. She looked at her watch. 8:14. I need the physical documents moved out of that room before the suspension executes, she said. If my access is suspended, I can't re-enter the records room, and if Holt gets down there before Jag can... We know, Okafor said. We're moving. Villarreal is already en route to the facility. She'll be at the main entrance in 11 minutes. A pause. But there's a second problem. Holt is not currently in the building. She stopped. He left the premises at 8:04, Okafor said. Building security logged him out. His car is gone. We have a unit watching the parking structure, but he had a 4-minute head start before we got the notification. Where would he go, she said, more to herself than to him. That's the question we're working. Another pause. He has a meeting scheduled at 9:15 at the regional oversight office, but the oversight office is 40 miles east. She was already moving down the stairwell toward the ground floor. He's not going to the oversight office, she said. Not at 8 a.m. with a 4-minute head start. She pushed through the ground floor door and came out into the main corridor. He's going somewhere he can make a call, or move something, or talk to someone who can make this stop before it becomes irreversible. We're tracking his phone. What does the signal show? A brief pause. He's stationary, 3 miles north of the facility. Another pause, longer. Miss Voss, that location is a private storage facility, industrial district. She stopped walking. A private storage facility. Not the oversight office. Not an attorney's office. Not anywhere on the administrative geography of a man covering a professional mistake. The specific chill of a wrong conclusion correcting itself moved through her. He's not just covering the supply skimming, she said. Okafor was quiet on the other end. The amounts in the documentation, she said, already recalculating. The amounts I tracked are small, consistent enough to add up, but individually small. Nobody runs a 14-month procurement fraud for the kind of total I documented. The program funding doesn't generate enough margin. She was thinking out loud now, moving fast through the logic. The supply orders are the mechanism, not the product. Explain, Okafor said. The fraudulent orders create a paper record of supply expenditure, legitimate-looking purchase orders, fulfilled on paper, nothing physically received. That's a common front for secondary transactions. You use the program as a wash channel. She kept her voice low in the corridor. The equipment and materials in the fraudulent orders, veterinary specification, medical grade, serialized. Those specifications match controlled use categories. She stopped. What is Briarwood listed as an approved distributor for? A pause that meant someone was looking something up. Then Okafor said, very carefully, Controlled Medical Supply Distribution, Federal Program Category, including veterinary specification controlled substances. The corridor was empty around her. The fluorescent hum, the linoleum, the intercom calling a patient transfer on 3. He's not skimming program funds, Nora said. He's using the program as a distribution front. The supply orders are covers for controlled substance procurement. Whatever he's moving, it's been going through the Meridian Program supply channel for 14 months. And at a private storage facility 3 miles north, Marcus Holt was stationary, standing somewhere among whatever it was that the falsified supply records had been used to move. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Not Okafor, not a known number. A text, 9 words, from an unknown local prefix. He didn't go alone. Someone from Regional is already there. She read it twice. Then she looked up and down the empty corridor. Then her radio crackled. The hospital's internal staff communication system, which she always kept clipped to her lanyard. And the voice that came through was the charge nurse from the surgical recovery floor, and it had a pitch in it that Nora had learned to read as the specific precursor to a situation that had already moved past the point of preventing. Voss, we need you on 3. Now. Arietta is in distress. Something's wrong with his monitors, and we've got a new admission coming in hot from the base. Possible cardiac. She was already moving. Whatever was happening 3 miles north would have to wait 60 seconds. Tomas Arietta could not. She took the stairs. The elevator at Briarwood ran about 4 seconds slower than it should have, and she had learned in the first month not to trust it when time was the variable that mattered. She hit the 3rd floor door at a controlled run, not sprinting, because sprinting in a hospital corridor caused a different kind of problem, and came through to surgical recovery with her radio already in her hand, and her mind splitting the way it had to split in situations like this. 1 track on the immediate clinical problem, 1 track still moving through the conversation with Okafor, 1 track on the unknown text, and a 4th track she kept quieter than the others, monitoring the shape of all of it together. The charge nurse, a solid and unflappable woman named Greta Sohn, met her at the corridor intersection with the particular expression of someone who had already triaged the situation and reached the limit of what she could handle without backup. Arietta's monitor threw a cascade alarm at 8:10, Greta said, moving alongside her. We reset it twice. 3rd time it threw a VFib reading, but his rhythm looks sinus on the manual check. I think the monitor's malfunctioning, not him, but I can't pull it for recalibration until we confirm. And the incoming? Sergeant Willa Ford, 41, active duty. Base medical flagged a cardiac event during PT 40 minutes ago. ETA 6 minutes. They're saying possible STEMI, but the field strip is ambiguous. Could be demand ischemia. Could be the real thing. They don't have a cardiologist on base right now. Who do we have? Dr. Navarro is in surgery until 10. Dr. Pham is off-site. Nora pushed into Arietta's room. He was awake, elevated, and looked annoyed rather than frightened, which was genuinely reassuring in the specific way that combat-trained patients were reassuring. They tended not to panic, which made clinical assessment cleaner. I didn't do anything, he said immediately. I know. She ran her hands over the monitor lead connections while her eyes tracked the displayed rhythm. The lead on his left shoulder had migrated. Not dramatically, maybe 2 centimeters, but enough on this particular monitor model to create a false artifact reading if the patient had shifted position in the night. She repositioned it and watched the display normalize. There, Greta said behind her. Swap this unit anyway, Nora said. Get the backup from room 8. This sensor array is degrading. She turned to Arietta. Any chest discomfort? Shortness of breath? Anything that felt off when the alarm went? No, I was reading. He paused. Is this about whatever's happening downstairs? She looked at him. 2 people in civilian clothes came through the main entrance 20 minutes ago, he said. One of them had a federal credentials wallet. I saw it when he badged at the reception desk from the window. He nodded at the window across the room, which had a sightline to the main entrance vestibule below. My CO said to watch for that. You're supposed to be resting. I rested. Now I'm observing. He met her eyes. You should know that there's a 3rd car in the federal cluster, parked on the north side of the building. I've been watching it for 40 minutes. Nobody got in or out, but the engine's been running. She filed that. I need you to stay in this bed and not do anything heroic. Story of this week, he said. She left the room at a controlled walk, pulled out her phone in the corridor and sent Okafor a text. 3rd vehicle, north side, engine running, unknown occupant. Then she put the phone away and went to meet Sergeant Willa Ford. Ford came in on a gurney with a field paramedic on one side and a base MP on the other, which was unusual enough that Nora clocked it immediately. The MP stayed at the door, not entering, just present, with the specific posture of an escort rather than a guard. The paramedic gave the handoff report fast and clean. Onset during a 3-mile PT run, substernal pressure, radiation to the left jaw, diaphoresis, initial field strip showing ST changes in leads 2 and 3 that had partially resolved by the 2nd strip 12 minutes later. Ford herself was pale and controlled and clearly furious about both conditions. I don't need a cardiologist, she said, through what was obviously a significant act of will. I need fluids and a 12 lead and to get back to my unit. You need a 12 lead, Nora agreed, already placing the electrodes with practiced efficiency. The rest we'll figure out from that. The 12 lead printed in 90 seconds. She read it the way she read everything. Fast, complete, without performing the reading for anyone watching. The ST changes were present but minimal. The pattern was consistent with demand ischemia, cardiac muscle stressed by exertion beyond current supply capacity, rather than acute blockage. Not a STEMI. Not benign either, but a different category of problem with a different management track. Your field strip was catching the tail end of the event, she told Ford. The rhythm is normalizing. You'll need cardiology follow-up and a troponin series. I'm drawing blood now, but I don't think we're looking at an acute MI. Ford exhaled through her nose. So I'm not dying. Not from this, today. Good. A pause. Who are the federal agents in the lobby? Nora's hand paused for half a second on the blood draw setup. I don't know what you mean, she said. Yes, you do. Ford's eyes were direct and unimpressed in the way of someone who had spent years evaluating people quickly in high-consequence environments. There are 2 agents in the lobby and a 3rd in a vehicle on the north side and a JAG major who has been in contact with my base command since Friday. She held still for the blood draw without being asked. I'm being transferred to Briarwood specifically today because my CO wanted eyes on the situation. Nora drew the blood, labeled the vials, and handed them to Greta without looking up. Then she straightened and looked at Ford directly. Your CO sent you to a hospital with a possible cardiac event as a surveillance asset. My CO sent me to a hospital because I had a possible cardiac event, Ford said evenly. The surveillance is incidental and voluntary. A pause. He said to tell you the base has a team standing by, whatever that means to you. It meant considerably more than Ford probably knew. It meant that the military chain that had been quietly paying attention since Tomas Arrieta's CO made his call on Friday had moved from observation to readiness. It meant that if whatever was happening at the storage facility 3 miles north went sideways, there was a response capacity that didn't depend on the compromised regional oversight channel. Rest, Nora told her. I'll be back for the troponin read in an hour. She went back to the corridor and checked her phone. 2 messages from Okafor. The first. 3rd vehicle is ours. Placed there this morning as backup observation. The second, sent 4 minutes later. Holt is moving. Leaving the storage facility now. He's coming back to the hospital. She looked at her watch. 8:47. Her access credentials were still active. The HR flagging action had been filed at 7:52. Under the hospital's protocol, the 2-hour suspension window meant her credentials would be reviewed for suspension at 9:52. If the HR office processed it on standard timeline, which assumed a normal Monday morning administrative load. She had roughly an hour. She walked to the stairwell. Downstairs, the situation had already moved without her. Special Agent Villarreal had arrived at the main entrance at 8:31 and been met by Diane Pressler, who had apparently been watching from the lobby since 8:20 with the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the mechanics of it to catch up. Pressler had walked Villarreal directly to the administrative records room without stopping at reception, without signing in through the visitor management system, and without telling anyone in Holt's administrative network that a federal agent was in the building. Nora found them both in the records room when she came down the sublevel corridor at 8:53. Villarreal was working through the documents Nora and Pressler had pulled, photographing each page with a device that was considerably more sophisticated than Nora's phone, while Pressler stood to the side with her arms crossed and the expression of someone watching a long overdue process finally run. "He's coming back," Nora said from the doorway. Villarreal didn't look up. "We know. Okafor is coordinating with the unit outside." She turned a page. "Did you know about the controlled substance angle before this morning?" "I suspected the supply orders were a wash mechanism. I didn't have the distribution layer." "The storage facility has a secondary registration," Villarreal said, "filed under a subsidiary of a medical equipment company that doesn't appear in any of the hospital's vendor contracts." She finally looked up. "Holt has a silent ownership stake in the subsidiary. We found it in the corporate registry at 6 a.m. today." Pressler made a short, involuntary sound that was not quite a word. "The Meridian program's supply orders created a paper trail of legitimate medical procurement," Villarreal continued. "The subsidiary used that paper trail to justify controlled substance purchase orders at the wholesale level. Veterinary specification-controlled analgesics, mostly fentanyl-adjacent compounds, cheaper to source in that designation, harder to track without cross-referencing the program records." She set the camera down for a moment. "The storage facility is where the physical product went. Not to the hospital, not to the program, to a distribution channel we haven't fully mapped yet." The records room was very quiet. 14 months, Pressler said, and this time it didn't sound like a realization. It sounded like grief. "The program funding irregularities are real, but they're secondary," Villarreal said. "The skimming covered operational costs, kept the paper trail clean, paid the subsidiaries filing fees, maintained the vendor relationship. The actual revenue stream is the controlled substance distribution." She picked up the camera again. "He used a federal veterans rehabilitation program. The dogs? The supply chain built to support the dogs. As a front." Nora stood in the doorway and thought about Ghost pressing his weight against a veteran's knee on a hard morning. About Titan on the padded floor with 3 people who had nowhere else to be in the world and needed something real to sit with. About the session report she'd seen that documented what the program actually did for the people it served, used as a front. She put that thought exactly where it needed to go and kept working. "What do you need from me before he gets back?" she asked Villarreal. "The notebook, formally submitted as supporting documentation. Your signature on a chain of custody form." Villarreal produced the form from a folder. "And your account of the altered documents in the Q3 batch, on record, dated, witnessed by Pressler and myself." Nora gave all 3. She signed the chain of custody form with her full legal name and her previous service designation, the one she had not written on any hospital document in 2 years and 4 months. Villarreal looked at it, didn't comment, filed it. They were done at 9:17. Holt's car came back into the parking structure at 9:22. Nora knew this because Arietta texted her from his window. Just a single letter, H, which she had not asked him to do, and which she would have told him not to do if she'd thought of it, and which was nonetheless useful. She was in the second-floor corridor running her normal morning medication rounds when it arrived, because the most dangerous thing she could have done at that moment was be anywhere that looked like she was doing anything other than her job. The medication round took 23 minutes. She completed it without rushing and without any of the 3 nurses she crossed paths with noticing anything different about her. The body camera was still running. She would give it to Villarreal at 10. At 9:48, her radio crackled. "Boss." It was Greta's voice from the charge station. "Holt's office called down. He wants to see you." She finished documenting the last medication timestamp in the patient chart she was holding. Then she put the chart back in its holder and picked up her radio. "Tell him I'll be up after I finish rounds," she said. 10 minutes. She spent those 10 minutes doing exactly what she said she was doing. Then she took the elevator. She could afford 4 extra seconds now. To the fourth floor where Holt's office occupied the corner suite with the window that looked down over the parking structure and the desert scrub at the perimeter. His assistant, a young man named Graham, who had always been professionally pleasant and who looked this morning like he hadn't slept and had spent the commute staring at the floor of his car, waved her through without the usual check-in. Holt was at his desk. The window was at his back. The morning light came through at an angle that should have been flattering and wasn't because his face was doing something it didn't usually do, moving. Too many things crossing it too quickly for him to manage in the way he usually managed his expressions. He had been to the storage facility. He had stood in whatever was there and understood at 9:22 when he pulled back into the parking structure that the situation had reached a point he could not redirect. He was trying to find a posture for it. "Close the door," he said. She closed it and stood in front of it. She did not sit. "I filed an HR action this morning," he said, "regarding your records room access. I'm aware. The access was unauthorized. I was assigned to documentation for both departments," she said. "The records room is part of that assignment. I have the written notification you submitted Friday." His jaw moved. The scope of the assignment included administrative records supporting the documentation rotation for both departments, she said. "That's the language in the notification. I have a copy." He leaned back slightly. Recalibrated. She watched him do it. Watched him shift from the prepared script to the improvised one, which was always where people revealed what they were actually working with. "You've been with this hospital 2 years, he said. "You came in under a general nursing credential from an out-of-state reference file that was thin. No prior hospital affiliations, an 8-year gap in your employment record." He watched her face. "I ran a background check this morning, paid for it personally." She said nothing. "The SARC designation came up," he said. "Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman, Navy, 2011 to 2019. He let that sit. 8 years. And then you show up here as a level 2 nurse with a thin credential file and an 8-year gap. People leave service," she said. "They rebuild. They usually tell their employer who they were. I applied for a nursing position. My nursing credentials are current and legitimate. My clinical skills are demonstrably adequate." She kept her voice completely neutral. "Is there a question?" He looked at her for a long moment. The recalibration was still running. She could see it, the search for an angle that would give him back control of the room. "The HR action stands," he said finally. "Pending review of your records access, your credentials are under evaluation. You're suspended from patient care duties effective." "Ms. Pressler has already been notified," Nora said. He stopped. "The CAO reviewed the HR action this morning and initiated a counter-review under Section 14 of the hospital's staff protection policy," Nora said, "which applies when an HR action is filed within the same operational period as a staff member's formal complaint." She paused. "I filed a formal complaint at 9:05 this morning through the hospital's ethics reporting system, which routes to the CAO's office, not to the department director." The silence in the room changed quality. He was very still. "The complaint documents 14 months of supply chain irregularities in the Meridian K9 recovery program's procurement records," she said, "with supporting cross-references, dated documentation, and photographic evidence of altered intake logs in the Q3 batch." She watched his face. "The complaint has been simultaneously transmitted to the Federal Ethics Reporting Channel, the JAG office, and the Meridian Program's Federal Oversight Coordinator." Holt's hands, which had been flat on the desk, moved slightly, then stopped. "You don't have—" he started. "I do," she said. "I've had it for months. I've been waiting until it was complete." He stood up. Slowly, with the kind of controlled movement that was designed to use height as leverage. He was taller than her by 5 inches, and he had spent a career understanding how to make that matter in a room. "Whatever you think you have," he said, with a quietness that was its own kind of threat, "you need to understand what happens to people who make accusations they can't support in an institutional environment. I have 6 years of administrative relationships in this facility. I have connections at the regional oversight level. The Regional Oversight Office is currently under a parallel federal inquiry," she said, "specifically regarding the delay of an audit flag that was submitted 7 weeks ago." She held his gaze. The inquiry was initiated by a JAG-adjacent task force. They've been in Harlan since Friday. The height stopped mattering. She watched it happen. The specific, visible moment when a person who has built their security on the assumption that no one is watching realizes that they have been watched thoroughly by someone they completely failed to see. The storage facility on Whitmore Industrial Road, she said quietly. The subsidiary registered under Paragon Medical Supply Solutions. The corporate filing with your name as a silent stakeholder. She tilted her head by a fraction. The controlled substance purchase orders that used this program's supply documentation as their paper cover. His face had gone to a color that wasn't quite any natural color. I want to speak to an attorney, he said. That's your right, she said. I'd start making that call. She opened his office door and walked out. Graham was at his desk, not pretending to be busy. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been holding a breath for a long time. She didn't say anything to him. She walked to the elevator and went back to her floor. Whoa. The formal arrest happened at 11:14 a.m. Okafor and Villarreal came in through the main entrance with 2 Harlan PD detectives and a federal marshal whose presence indicated that the charges had already been formalized at a level above the local jurisdiction. Pressler met them at the lobby, which she had quietly cleared of non-essential staff in the preceding 20 minutes. With the practiced calm of an administrator who had been waiting for this and had organized the logistics accordingly. Holt came down from the 4th floor with Graham, who had, it turned out, called him the moment Nora left the office and told him, in a voice that shook slightly, that he thought it was time to come down. Graham had also, in those same 12 minutes, printed and handed Holt the name of a criminal defense attorney with federal experience, because Graham had a practical streak underneath the professional pleasantness and had apparently decided that doing his job to the end of it was simply the kind of person he was. The lobby was not empty despite Pressler's efforts. Hospitals don't empty easily. There were orderlies and 2 nurses from the 2nd floor and a pharmacist named Bert Saulnier who had been walking through at the wrong moment and would spend the next 3 weeks telling people he'd been there for it. There was Declan Marsh, who had come in for a scheduled session and had stopped at the edge of the lobby when he saw the federal marshal and done a rapid professional assessment of the room that ended with him standing very still with his hands in his jacket pockets. There was Kezia Fonodi behind him, and behind her on their leashes, and alert to the tension in the space the way they were always alert to things that mattered, were Titan, Ranger, and Ghost. Holt saw the dogs when he stepped out of the elevator. He saw Okafor, he saw the marshal, he saw Pressler and Villarreal, and the 2 Harlan PD detectives positioned at each exit. He saw Nora, who was standing to the left of the reception desk in her scrubs and her worn tactical boots, with her badge on her lanyard and her notebook in her bag, and 11 months of careful, quiet work already in federal hands. He had nothing to say. He had run out of words that could do anything useful, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was visible on him in a way that nothing professional he had ever worn was. Okafor read the charges in a voice that was measured and complete and carried in the lobby's acoustics further than anyone expected. Federal procurement fraud, controlled substance distribution through a federal program channel, obstruction of a federal audit, conspiracy with a regional government official, that last charge landing in the room like a stone into still water, with the particular weight of something that implicated more than one person and more than one institution. Holt was cuffed at 11:19 and walked out through the main entrance into the Nevada morning, past the desert scrub, and the cars and the ravens that were working the dumpster enclosure again because ravens, unlike institutions, never changed their behavior based on what humans were doing nearby. The lobby was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then it was not quiet at all. Bum. Nora spent the hour after the arrest doing her job. She went back to surgical recovery and checked Arietta's updated vitals and his drain, still correctly positioned, still indicating appropriate healing. And he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had watched something he'd hoped would happen and found that it felt different than he'd expected. Not smaller, just different. "You okay?" he asked. "Running on rounds," she said. "That's not what I asked." She made a note in his chart. "Ask me again in a week." She checked Ford's troponin results, which came back borderline elevated, consistent with demand ischemia rather than infarction, exactly as she'd read from the 12 lead. She went through the findings with Ford directly, who listened without interrupting and asked 2 specific intelligent questions and then said she needed to call her CO. Use the room phone, Nora said. Your personal phone shouldn't be your first call right now. Ford looked at her. Because someone might be monitoring it? Because your CO is going to want to document the call, and a room phone creates a hospital record of the contact time. She paused. For the report. Ford picked up the room phone. By 1 p.m., the fourth floor had been accessed by 3 additional federal personnel who spent 2 hours in Holt's office removing files and equipment with the methodical efficiency of a process that had been planned before any of today's events. Graham had been formally interviewed and released. His cooperation, which had apparently begun the moment Holt's car had left the parking structure at 8:04, was documented and on record. 2 additional staff members were asked to provide written statements. Both complied. Patrick Solis found Nora in the medication room at 1:35, which was where she went when she needed to do something that required concentration and was unlikely to be interrupted. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "How long have you been running this?" "Running what?" she said. "Don't." He leaned against the frame. "I know you've been logging the supply discrepancies. Greta told me about the records room. I'm not asking to be in on it. I just want to know how long you've been doing this alone." She looked at him. Patrick Solis, who had brought up Holt's treatment of her in a conversation 11 months ago and been shut down by the charge nurse and gone back to work anyway. Who had found ways, small and consistent ones, to cover corridor tasks that shouldn't have been hers without making a thing of it. "Long enough," she said. "Could have asked for help." "From who?" He was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said, "but still." She put the last medication back in its designated position and closed the tray. "You want to help now? Check on Arietta at 3. His drain needs a second look, and I've got a documentation meeting with federal agents that I can't move." He straightened. "Yeah, okay." He started to go, then stopped. "The dogs are still here. Marsh didn't pull them. I thought he might after everything, but they're running the afternoon session." She hadn't known that. She filed it without showing that it had landed anywhere specific. "Good," she said. The documentation meeting with Okafor and Villarreal ran from 2 p.m. to 4:15 and covered, in methodical sequence, every element of the evidence chain: the notebook, the photographs, the chain of custody forms, the body camera footage, and Nora's formal recorded account of each stage of her independent documentation process over the 11 months preceding the arrest. Pressler attended for the portion that concerned the internal investigation. Grayfield attended for the portion that concerned the Meridian program specifically. At 3:40, Okafor set his pen down and looked across the table. "I want to ask you something off the record," he said. "All right. You came to Briarwood 2 years ago with a SARC background and a thin credential file. You spent 11 months building a case that most trained investigators wouldn't have run solo." He paused. "Why didn't you come forward sooner? You had a recognizable pattern by month 4. She had thought about this. Not obsessively. She wasn't built for obsession. She was built for sequential problem solving. But enough to have an answer. "Month 4, I had a pattern," she said. "Patterns can be explained by clerical error. Month 7, I had a correlation. Correlations can be challenged. Month 11, I had a case." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't going to hand an incomplete file to a channel I didn't know was clean and watch it disappear the way Polly's tip disappeared. I needed it to be complete enough that it couldn't be buried." She paused. "I also didn't know about the distribution layer until this morning. If I'd moved earlier, the storage facility might have been cleared before anyone got there." Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notes. "On record again," he said. The meeting continued. At 4:15 it ended, and Nora walked out of the conference room and down the corridor toward the nursing station to pick up the afternoon handoff notes. And her phone buzzed with a message from a number she'd stored under Grayfield's name that morning. She read it standing in the corridor. "Controlled Substance Distribution Network is larger than we estimated. Briarwood was not the only facility. 2 other veterans' hospitals in the state using similar program structures. Federal expansion of the investigation is being authorized. We need to know if your documentation covers supply chain anomalies prior to your arrival at Briarwood." She read it twice. Prior to her arrival. Before month 1, before the notebook. Her employment at Briarwood had begun 28 months ago. The documentation she held covered 11 months. Grayfield was asking if she had anything from before month 1, anything from the period she hadn't been assigned documentation duties. She didn't. But she knew who might. She had a name, a location 40 miles away, and a woman who had made an anonymous tip 6 months ago and then gone quiet because she had calculated that she was done. Ruth Ann Pauley. Nora looked at the message again. 2 other veterans' hospitals, a network larger than Briarwood, the supply chain mechanism running through multiple federal program channels across multiple facilities. And Pauley had been at Briarwood in the early period of the operation, the period before Nora arrived, the period when the mechanism was being established. She put the phone in her pocket and picked up the handoff notes and went to work the rest of her shift, because that was what the next 4 hours required, and she had always been capable of doing the thing that was required in front of her while the larger shape of something worked itself out in the background. But at 7 p.m., when her shift ended and she changed her boots in the locker room and sat on the bench with the notebook in her hands, she turned to the page with the asterisk, the one she'd placed there 3 weeks ago, the marker for things that needed resolution before the picture was complete. And she looked at the name she'd written there, Pauley, R. Witness or participant? Resolve. The asterisk was still there, the question was still open. And if Pauley had seen the beginning of this, if she had 3 months of early-stage documentation that would extend the case backward and outward into the network that Grayfield's message had just described, then Pauley's silence was not just about protecting herself. It was the last piece. Nora put the notebook back in her bag. She had Pauley's clinic location from the hospital's old staff records, which she had photographed 8 months ago on the reasonable assumption that it might matter eventually. She had a car. She had the evening. She had Okafor's number. She also had, in the morning's federal paperwork, one detail that had not yet been shared with her, a detail that Villarreal had noted in the evidence log in a way that Nora had seen over Villarreal's shoulder during the chain of custody review and which had stayed with her ever since. The corporate filing for Paragon Medical Supplies Solutions, Holt's silent ownership stake. She had registered that detail when Villarreal first mentioned it. What she had also registered, and had not yet mentioned to anyone, was that Paragon had a second silent stakeholder. The name in the filing was not one she recognized, but the address associated with it was the Regional Oversight Office in Darrow, Nevada. Not a person, a position, a role designation, the way some corporate filings used institutional affiliations rather than personal names for stakeholder registration. Whoever held that regional oversight role was Holt's partner, the person who had killed Pauley's tip, the person who had buried the audit flag for 7 weeks, the person who had made it possible for this to run for 14 months through 2 veterans' hospitals, and apparently more. Holt had been arrested. The arrest was documented and public and would hold. But the person at the Regional Oversight Office, whoever sat in that chair, whoever had filed their name as a position title rather than a person, had not been arrested, had not been named in the charges, had not, as far as Nora could tell from this afternoon's documentation meeting, been conclusively identified, and they had been in contact with Holt this morning, at the storage facility, before he came back. Someone from Regional is already there. The text she had received in the corridor. 9 words. Unknown local prefix. She looked at it again now. The number was local to Harlan, not regional. Whoever had sent it was not calling from 40 miles east. They were here. She called Okafor from the parking structure before she started the car. He picked up on the second ring and she gave him the information in the order that mattered. The second stakeholder in the Paragon filing, the position title registration, the regional oversight connection, and the unknown local number that had sent her a 9-word text from inside Harlan at 8:22 that morning while Holt was stationary 3 miles north. Okafor was quiet for longer than he usually was. "You saw the second stakeholder in the filing," he said, "during the chain of custody review. Over Villarreal's shoulder, yes. You didn't mention it in the meeting. I didn't have the text message connection until after the meeting." She paused. "I'm mentioning it now." Another silence. She could hear the background noise of whatever room he was in. Voices, movement, the specific ambient texture of an active federal workspace that had been running since before dawn. "The position title in the filing," he said, "Regional Program Compliance Officer, Western District. That's not a hospital position. That's a federal program position." "I know." which means the second stakeholder isn't someone Holt recruited from within Briarwood. It's someone inside the federal program oversight structure who recruited Holt or partnered with him at the institutional level. He paused. This is bigger than one hospital director. I know that too, she said. Grayfield's message said 2 other facilities. At minimum, a beat. Ms. Voss, the text you received this morning, the local number. Do you still have it? Yes. Send it to me. Don't call it. Don't respond to it. I wasn't going to. I know you weren't. A brief pause that had something close to respect in it. The Ruth Ann Polly angle. Grayfield mentioned she was asking about pre-arrival documentation. Polly was there in the early period. If the mechanism was being established before I arrived, she may have records from that phase. We've had passive surveillance on Polly's location since she made the anonymous tip, Okafor said. We didn't approach her because we didn't have enough to protect her if someone from the operation decided she was a liability. His voice shifted slightly. We have enough now. I'm sending a team to her location tonight. I'd like to be there, Nora said. A pause. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Not the tactical answer, the true one. Because she noticed the same thing I noticed, she said, and she didn't have anyone to pass it to, and she's been sitting with that for 8 months. She looked out through the parking structure's concrete columns at the Nevada evening. Someone should go who understands what that's like. Okafor was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I'll send you the address. You go with Villarreal. Not alone. Understood. Ruth Ann Polly lived in a rental house in a suburb east of Garrett Falls, the small city 40 miles from Harlan where she'd taken her clinic position. The neighborhood was the kind that existed in transitional zones between what a city wanted to be and what it currently was. Decent houses, modest lots, the particular exhausted quiet of people who came home from work and locked the door and tried not to think too hard about the distance between their current life and some other life they'd once imagined. Villarreal drove. She was quieter on the road than she was in meetings, which Nora had expected based on how she operated in professional settings, and the drive was mostly silent in a way that was comfortable rather than tense. How long have you been federal? Nora asked at one point. 11 years, Villarreal said. Criminal investigation before this. Procurement fraud unit for the last 4. You like it? A pause. I like when it lands, she said. The in-between is hard. She glanced over briefly. You? I like the work, Nora said. The structure got complicated. Villarreal nodded without asking anything further, which was its own kind of professional respect. They arrived at 7:58. The house had a light on in the front room and a car in the narrow driveway and a small, deliberately maintained garden border that said something about a person trying to make a place feel like it was theirs, even when they weren't sure it was going to be permanent. Villarreal knocked. Nora stood slightly back. The woman who opened the door was 43, with the careful posture of someone who had spent months being quietly alert, and eyes that processed Villarreal's credentials, and then found Nora and stopped there for a moment that was longer than it should have been. I know who you are, Polly said to Nora. Not accusatory, just certain. Briarwood staff photo. I looked you up when the hospital sent the new roster to the clinic referral network 6 months ago. She stepped back from the door. Come in. Inside was as careful as outside, minimal, functional, with a quality of impermanence that Nora recognized from her own apartment. The temporary arrangement of someone who hadn't decided yet whether they were staying. They sat at the kitchen table. Polly made coffee without asking if anyone wanted it, which Nora respected because it gave her hands something to do and her back something to turn while she organized herself. I've been waiting for this, Polly said, setting 3 cups down. I didn't know if it would be federal agents or something else. She sat. After I made the tip and nothing happened, I thought maybe something else. Nothing happened because your tip was intercepted, Villarreal said. The regional compliance officer delayed the audit flag. Polly closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I figured, eventually. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I have documentation from my time at Briarwood. She looked at Nora. I didn't know what it was at first. The supply orders? In the early months, they were subtle. I noticed an irregularity in month 2 and brought it to Holt. We know, Villarreal said. He reassigned me within the week. Her jaw tightened. I took everything I'd logged before I left, copies. I didn't know if it would mean anything, but I made copies of everything and I've been keeping them in a file for 8 months in case someone eventually showed up. She looked between them. Someone who wasn't connected to the people who were running it. She got up and left the kitchen. They heard a closet door, the specific sound of a box being lifted from a shelf, footsteps returning. She put a manila folder on the table, thick, rubber-banded, with dates written on the tab in careful handwriting. 3 months, she said, month 1 through month 3. The beginning. Nora looked at the folder, at the 8 months of carrying it, at the woman who had noticed something wrong, tried the right channel, gotten punished for it, made the only other move available to her, and then gone quiet and waited and kept the evidence anyway because she had not been able to bring herself to destroy it. "You did the right thing," Nora said. Polly laughed, a short, involuntary sound that had no humor in it. "I left." "After you tried," Nora said, "and when the channel failed, you made the tip. And when that didn't move, you kept the documentation instead of throwing it away." She paused. "Most people throw it away." Polly looked at her for a moment. Something in her face that had been braced against impact shifted very slightly. "Will it hold?" she asked. "In court?" "With what we have from Briarwood, and what's in that folder," Villarreal said. "Yes, it will hold." Polly pushed the folder across the table. They drove back to Harlan at 9:30 with the folder in an evidence bag in the back of Villarreal's car. And the case, finally, fully assembled, all the pieces in the right hands, the chain of custody documented, the timeline complete from month 1 at Briarwood, through the morning of the arrest and everything between. Nora looked out the window at the desert dark and the lights of small towns at intervals and thought about the specific arithmetic of it, what 14 months of a fraud operation cost, in the narrow financial sense, and what it cost in the other sense. The veterans sitting in therapy sessions who were supposed to have better equipment, the dogs running lean because their nutrition budget had been skimmed, the audit that should have triggered 6 weeks earlier and stopped it sooner, the people, like Polly, who had done the correct thing and absorbed the consequences of it in silence because the system that was supposed to protect whistleblowers had the same person at its gate who was running the fraud. None of it was clean. None of it had a clean answer. Even now, with the documentation complete and the charges filed and Holt in custody, there were things that had been lost in those 14 months that couldn't be recovered by an arrest. That was the true weight of it. Not the drama of the takedown, but the long, slow cost of a thing that ran too long because the people who noticed it couldn't find a clear path to make it stop. She didn't write any of that in the notebook. Some things didn't need to be written down because they were already sufficiently present. The second arrest came 4 days later. The regional program compliance officer for the Western District was a man named Gordon Steele, 56 years old, 22 years in federal program oversight, the kind of institutional permanence that had made him effectively invisible to the audit mechanisms he was supposed to operate. He had been at the position long enough that his name appeared in program documentation so routinely that it stopped registering as a name and started registering as a function. He had used that invisibility with precision. The corporate filing under Paragon Medical Supply Solutions listed his position title rather than his name, which would have been a clever evasion if the position title hadn't been uniquely held. His role as the gatekeeper of the audit channel that Polly's tip had entered meant that he had been able to intercept, reroute, and effectively bury any documentation that moved through the standard federal reporting pathway. What he hadn't accounted for was a JAG-adjacent task force that had been building a parallel case from outside the standard pathway since the initial audit flag had raised an anomaly, not in the program records, but in the oversight response time. The response time flag had gone to a compliance analyst at a different federal agency who had noted it, passed it to a colleague, and that colleague had eventually gotten it to Grayfield's office, which was how Grayfield had ended up in Harlan in the first place, months before the K9 session that nobody planned. The parallel case had needed the Briarwood documentation to complete the chain. Without the supply records and the altered intake logs, the response time anomaly and oversight was suggestive but not prosecutable. With them, it was the connective tissue between Holt's operation and Steele's protection of it. Polly's early period documentation pushed the conspiracy timeline back beyond any statute of limitations defense Steele's attorneys might have attempted. Steele was arrested at his home in Reno on a Thursday morning. The arrest was not public in the way Holt's had been. No lobby, no witnesses, no dogs and handlers in the background. It was a federal operation conducted with the quiet efficiency of a process that had been carefully prepared and needed no audience to be effective. Nora learned about it from Grayfield, who sent a message at 9 a.m. that said simply, "Steele is in custody. Charges filed federally. The case is complete." She was in the middle of a medication round when the message arrived. She finished the round before she let herself feel anything about it. The feeling, when it arrived, was not triumph. It was closer to the specific exhaustion that follows the release of something you have been holding for a long time. Not collapse, just the body's honest accounting of the weight it has been carrying and the fact that the carrying is now done. She stood in the corridor for 30 seconds with her hand against the wall and breathed, and then she went back to work. The internal review of Holt's conduct at Briarwood took 6 weeks and produced a report that was, by institutional standards, unusually specific about its findings. The review documented the systematic misuse of staff assignment authority, the deliberate expansion of Nora's workload as a mechanism of professional suppression, the exploitation of her compliance as cover for the documentation fraud, and the use of the HR flagging action as an attempted retaliatory measure on the morning of the arrest. Diane Pressler presented the review findings to the hospital board in a closed session, then issued a summary to all department staff the following Monday. The summary did not name Nora specifically. That had been Pressler's choice, and she had made it after a brief conversation with Nora the previous week, in which Nora had said, without particular emphasis, that she preferred the summary focus on systemic corrections rather than individual acknowledgement. Pressler had looked at her for a moment and then said, "That's very you." "Is it?" Nora said. "Yes, unhelpfully so." Pressler had paused. "I'm going to disregard your preference on this one." The summary named her. It described, in careful institutional language, the conduct of a staff member who had identified serious irregularities, maintained documentation under significant professional pressure, and brought forward a case that had protected the hospital's veteran patients, the Meridian K9 program, and the integrity of federal healthcare funding. It noted that the staff member in question had been subjected to retaliatory assignment practices, and that those practices were being addressed through a comprehensive review of departmental authority structures. Patrick Solis read the summary in the break room and came to find Nora on the floor immediately afterward. "You could have told me more," he said. "I needed the case to be complete before I moved. I mean, in general, over the past year, you could have—" He stopped. "No, you couldn't have. I understand why you couldn't." He leaned against the wall. "Does it feel different, having it be done?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "It feels like the weight moved," she said. "It doesn't disappear. It moves." He nodded slowly. "What happens to the dogs?" "Program continues," she said. "Full funding restored. Grayfield is overseeing a compliance audit of the other facilities in the network. Marsh is staying on as senior handler." Patrick exhaled. "Good." He straightened. "Also, Greta wants to buy you dinner. She's been trying to figure out how to ask." "Tell her Thursday," Nora said. "And somewhere with actual food, not the place with the $12 salads." He smiled. "The real kind, not the professional one." "Yeah, okay." She went to the K9 rehabilitation room on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks after the arrests, when she wasn't assigned to a session and had no official reason to be there. Marsh was running a standard engagement with a group of 4 veterans from the inpatient unit, 2 men and 2 women, all somewhere in the complicated middle of recovery that didn't have a clear endpoint and required presence more than solutions. He saw her through the glass and opened the door. She sat on the bench at the edge of the room, outside the primary engagement zone, and watched the session for 20 minutes without participating. Ghost noticed her first, of course he did, and glanced in her direction with the assessing look he used for room changes, and then, apparently satisfied with whatever he found, went back to his work. It was Titan who eventually came to her. Not immediately. He finished his circuit of the room, checked on each of the 4 veterans in the particular way he had that involved no performance and no urgency, just presence, and then walked to where she was sitting and stood in front of her and looked at her with his ruined ear and his operational eyes and the weight of whatever he carried from a life that had not been easy in any of its chapters. She put her hand on his head. He leaned into it. "You did good work," she said quietly. You all did. He stayed there for a moment, then he turned and went back to the session because there were still people in the room who needed him, and he understood that without being told. Marsh sat beside her on the bench. Grayfield wants to know if you'd be willing to consult for the program, he said. Formally. Not as a handler, as a medical advisor for the K9 rehabilitation protocols. She thinks the nutrition flagging you did alone justifies the position. I have a job, Nora said. The position would be concurrent, part-time. Unfunded initially, but Grayfield's putting a budget request through the restored program allocation. She watched Ghost settle beside a veteran who had been sitting with her arms around her knees for most of the session, pressed against her shin in the steady, patient way that didn't ask anything and gave everything. Tell Grayfield I'll read the protocol documentation, she said. I already told her you'd say that. Then why did you pitch it like it was new information? He almost smiled. Professional courtesy. She looked at the room, at the 4 veterans and the 3 dogs and the padded floor and the low light and the particular quality of a space that had been specifically designed to hold people in the process of being rebuilt. It was imperfect in all the ways real things were imperfect. It was also, in those imperfections, completely real. I'll read the documentation, she said again. That's all I'm committing to. That's enough, he said. What? The formal recognition came 6 weeks after that. It was not a ceremony. Nora had made clear through Pressler that a ceremony was not something she would attend, and Pressler, who was learning the specific geography of which preferences of Nora's to override and which to respect, had let that one stand. Instead, the Meridian K9 Recovery Program's Federal Oversight Board issued a commendation that went into Nora's official record, both her nursing file at Briarwood and, through a process she hadn't fully anticipated, her reactivated military service file, which had been updated for the first time in 2 years. The commendation cited her role in preserving the program's operational integrity, her documentation methodology, and what it described, in language that was more precise than commendations usually were, as her sustained professional conduct under conditions of deliberate institutional suppression. Grayfield sent it to her as a PDF attachment with a message that said, "This doesn't cover it, but it's a start." Nora read it once. Then she filed it in the folder on her laptop that she kept for documents she needed to have but didn't need to look at regularly. What she kept on her kitchen table, where she could see it in the mornings, was the page from her notebook. Not the evidence pages, not the cross-references, but one page she'd torn out weeks ago, the one from the first Monday of the documentation rotation, with 4 items on it and a 5th line at the bottom. Protein deficiency noted, Ghost. Will flag through program documentation channel. That was the one that mattered. That was the morning she had been assigned to a room full of records by a man who thought he knew exactly what she was, and she had done her job and noticed something small and wrote it down because noticing things was what she did, and that small noticing had eventually connected to everything else. The small things were always connecting to everything else. That was what people who dismissed quiet people never understood, that the ones who don't make noise are not the ones who aren't paying attention. They are often the ones paying the most attention, precisely because they have learned that attention is what you do instead of performing. She had been performing nothing for 2 years and 4 months at Briarwood. She had simply been there, doing the work, recording what she saw, and trusting that the record would eventually be worth what it cost to keep it. It had been worth it. But she was honest enough with herself to know that it could just as easily not have been. If Grayfield's program hadn't flagged the behavioral response, if Marsh hadn't asked the right questions, if Polly had thrown the folder away 8 months ago instead of putting it on a closet shelf in a rental house and waiting, if Arietta's CO hadn't made a phone call, if Pressler had been part of the operation rather than running her own silent investigation against it, if any one of those things had been different, the case might have stalled in the same regional channel where Polly's tip had disappeared. The people who said that doing the right thing always works out are people who haven't been paying attention to the right things. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes the notebook ends up in a drawer and the evidence goes stale and the people running the fraud outlast the people trying to document it. What you did with that knowledge, whether it made you stop or whether it made you more careful, that was the actual character question. Not the dramatic one, not the one that made good stories. The quiet daily one that nobody watched you answer. Nora had answered it every morning for 2 years and 4 months. In an apartment with no photographs and a kitchen table that doubled as a desk, driving to a hospital in the Nevada desert where nobody thought she was anything in particular, doing a job she was overqualified for and doing it well, and keeping a notebook that nobody asked to see. That was the story. Not the arrest, not the commendation, not the moment Titan walked across the rehabilitation room floor and pressed his head against her knee in a recognition that moved through 3 former military working dogs, simultaneously like a current through water. The story was the Tuesday mornings, the inventory cross-references, the entry in the notebook that said flagging through documentation channel after she noticed Ghost running lean, because flagging it was correct and correct was what you did, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. 8 months after the arrests, Briarwood Veterans Medical Center launched a formal supply chain integrity review process, a permanent, independent audit mechanism that reported to the board rather than to any single department director, with quarterly external verification built into the funding cycle. Pressler had built the framework. She had used Nora's documentation methodology as its structural foundation, which she acknowledged in the board presentation in terms that made 2 of the board members visibly surprised that such a thing had been running informally in their facility for over a year. 3 other veterans' hospitals in the network implemented similar mechanisms within the following 6 months, as the federal investigation expanded and produced findings that changed the oversight structure at the regional level. Gordon Steele was convicted on 7 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit procurement fraud, obstruction of a federal audit, and misuse of a government compliance position for personal financial gain. His sentencing included restitution requirements that would outlast any professional life he might have imagined. Marcus Holt pleaded guilty to 4 counts in a negotiated agreement that his attorney had spent 3 months constructing and that the federal prosecution had spent 3 months ensuring would not result in anything that could be described as a favorable outcome. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal custody and permanently barred from any administrative role in a federally funded healthcare facility. The Paragon Medical Supply Solutions subsidiary was dissolved. The controlled substance distribution network it had served was investigated across 6 months by a joint task force and resulted in 18 additional charges against individuals across 3 states who had no connection to Briarwood but had used similar federal program channels as distribution infrastructure. The amount of controlled substances recovered from the network exceeded what any of the initial projections had estimated. Nora read the final case summary that Okafor sent her and thought about the number and what it represented in practical terms. In the communities where those substances had been headed, in the people who had not received them because the network had been disrupted before it finished its run. That arithmetic was invisible in any document. It didn't appear in the charges or the sentencing or the program reform framework. It was there. She knew it was there. That was enough. The last Wednesday of October, she went back to the rehabilitation room because it was a scheduled session day, and she had, 3 months prior, formally accepted the part-time medical advisory position with the Meridian program. She had read the protocol documentation twice and had submitted a 12-page recommendations memo that Grayfield had described, in a voicemail that had a note of amusement in it, as the most thorough unsolicited protocol analysis the program had received in 11 years of operation. She walked through the ground floor corridor with her badge on her lanyard and her notebook in her bag and her new boots, which she had finally replaced, same style, because she saw no reason to change what worked. The left lace had already started to show wear at the eyelet, because apparently that was a feature of her existence and not of the boots. Marsh was setting up when she arrived. The veterans coming in for this session were a different group than the previous one. 4 men from the outpatient trauma recovery program, ranging from 26 to 58, at different points in the particular nonlinear process of putting something back together that had been broken in ways that didn't have clean edges. Titan, Ranger, and Ghost were already in the room. Ghost saw her first, as he always did, and did what he always did. Registered her, confirmed something, returned his attention to the room. Ranger was at the far wall, arranged in the specific posture that meant he was already reading the incoming group from the sound of their footsteps in the corridor. Titan was in the center of the room, which was where Titan positioned himself when he was working, because the center of the room was where the most people needed something. She sat on the bench at the edge and opened the notebook to a fresh page. Not to document irregularities, not to build a case, just to note what she saw, the way she had always noted what she saw, because noticing was the practice, and the practice was what she was. The veterans came in one at a time. The session settled into its rhythm. The particular quiet of a room that has been designed to hold difficult things without amplifying them. Ghost moved first toward the youngest of the four, who sat down on the floor immediately and stayed there with his eyes on the middle distance, and Ghost settled beside him without invitation and without performance and without asking anything in return. Titan went to the oldest, a man who walked slowly and had the kind of hands that had done hard things for a long time and now shook slightly when they were still. He sat in the chair closest to the door, which was where people sat when they weren't sure they were staying. Titan sat in front of him and looked at him and waited, and after about 3 minutes the man put one shaking hand on the dog's head and kept it there. Ranger stayed moving, checking the room, circling the perimeter, maintaining the awareness that was his particular contribution, the one that kept the space from feeling enclosed. Nora watched all of it and wrote nothing because there was nothing to write. The session was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was not something that required documentation. It required presence. Marsh sat beside her after 10 minutes. "You're not going to give me another 12-page memo, are you?" he said. "Not today." He nodded. They watched the room together for a while. "Does it feel different?" he asked. "Being here now versus—" "Yes," she said, and "no." She thought about how to say the true thing accurately. "I came here to do one job and ended up doing two. The one I was assigned and the one I noticed needed doing." She looked at the room, at the dogs and the men and the slow, imperfect work of one morning. "The second one is done. The first one keeps going." She paused. "That's the part that feels different. The first one means more now." Marsh considered this. "Why?" "Because I know what it was being used against," she said, "and it survived that, and it's still here." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Grayfield is putting your advisory position into the program's permanent staffing structure. Full integration, not just consultation. The budget passed last week." She told me. "And?" "And I said I'd give her an answer by the end of the month." He tilted his head. "That's not a no." "It's not a no," she agreed. She looked at the page in her notebook. Blank. The October light coming through the window at the far end of the room, catching the dust in the air the way light did in rooms that held a lot of living, turning it briefly visible before it settled again. She thought about what it meant to be the person who didn't announce themselves, who didn't require the room to know what they'd done or what they'd survived or what it had cost them to keep going, when the easier option was to put the notebook away and process the records the way they'd been handed to her and not ask what they added up to. She had not made that choice because she was exceptional. She had made it because she was stubborn and trained, and because she had spent too many years in environments where the small things mattered to stop believing that they did. It was not heroism. It was not even courage in the way stories usually meant it. It was something more like, she knew what she knew, and she wrote it down, and she didn't stop writing it down until someone was in a position to use it. Anyone could do that. Not everyone did. The man with the shaking hands had his eyes closed now, his hands still on Titan's head. The youngest veteran had shifted from the floor to a chair, but Ghost had followed him without breaking contact, and the boy, he was 24, she'd read his intake notes, 24 years old and carrying something that most people never touched in a lifetime, had his head bent at an angle that meant he was holding something back, and Ghost simply sat with him in it. That was the work. That was what the program was for. That was what 14 months of a fraud operation had been trying to absorb, and had failed to kill, and had ultimately, through all its wrong moves and its underestimations, and its belief that a quiet woman with a notebook was not paying attention, ended up making stronger. She picked up the pen. On the blank page she wrote one line, not because it needed to be recorded, but because some things were worth the ink. The room is doing what it should do. The people in it are exactly where they need to be. She closed the notebook. Titan looked at her from across the room, just for a moment, between one thing and the next. And in that moment she understood, in the wordless way that some understanding arrived, that this was not an ending and it was not a beginning. It was the place after both of those, the ordinary continued present where the work happened and the work mattered, and nobody was keeping score of how loud you were while you did it. She had spent 2 years and 4 months being nobody in particular at a hospital in the Nevada desert. She had spent those same 2 years and 4 months being exactly who she was. The difference between those two things was the whole story, and the whole story was this. The people who underestimate the quiet ones are not wrong to notice the quiet. They are wrong about what it means. Quiet is not absence. Quiet is sometimes the most deliberate thing a person can be. The choice to move without announcing yourself, to build without performing the building, to carry the weight of what you know without letting it become a display. She had carried it. She had built it. She had waited until the time was right, and then she had moved, and the thing she had built over 11 months in a handwritten notebook had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The room breathed around her. The dogs worked. The men in the chairs did the hard, invisible labor of being present to themselves. And Nora Voss sat on the bench at the edge of it all with her notebook closed and her boots wearing out at the same eyelid as always. And she was not thinking about the commendation in her file, or the case summary, or the arrests, or the program reforms, or any of the things that made the story something worth telling to someone else. She was thinking about Ghost, who was going to need his weight checked again next week, and whether the new nutrition protocol she'd recommended was showing results yet, and what she was going to write in the follow-up memo. She was thinking about the work, which meant, finally, that everything was exactly as it should be.